It was round, not a head, not a body. It was a whole being. A perfect, transparent sphere the size of a pea lay at the bottom of something stony and completely dry. It had no eyes, but it could see. It had no ears, but it could hear the creaking of a rope somewhere high above it. It had no lungs, and for some reason that seemed normal. Daniel Rowe, 34 years old, a senior mechanic and a hydro engineer on a deep-sea rescue vessel, lay at the bottom of a dried-up well in the form of a drop of water, trying not to go mad. The last thing he remembered was the icy, salty water in his lungs and the face of a terrified sailor whom he had pushed through the escape hatch. And now he was a pea, a transparent, trembling pea at the bottom of a stone sack in a place that smelled of dust and dead moss. Light was falling from above, round and distant. The well's opening. He's in the well. All right, Mechanic Rowe
assesses the situation before panicking. That's how he was taught. The stone around him was old. The masonry was hand-laid. The joints between the blocks had dried out so much that he could have slipped a finger into them. If he'd had a finger.
Here and there on the walls hung shreds of dead moss, brown and brittle. This well hadn't seen water in a very long time. Up above, the rope creaked again. Someone was turning the winch. An empty wooden bucket plummeted down, clattering against the walls, and hit the bottom half a meter away from him, kicking up a cloud of fine dust. Daniel heard a voice, an elderly one, cracked and weary. The old man was telling someone that it was empty again, that he'd warned Grandpa Khan that today they were at a Melinar today. At least they serve food there. The bucket crept back up, scraping against the walls. Daniel was left alone. He tried to move and discovered he could. Not the way people move. He could flow, shift, change shape from a pea to a pancake and back again. It felt like stretching after a long sleep. Only his whole body stretched at once because his whole body was a single entity. He noticed a drop. A tiny drop of dew was rolling down the dead moss right above him. He didn't know how to explain what he did next. He simply wanted the drop to fall toward him. He reached out, not with his hand, not even with his mind, with something simpler and more ancient than thought. The droplet broke free. It fell. It touched him, and it became part of him. He grew twice as large, and something sounded in his head. Not a voice, not words, more like a sensation that took shape as data. Source, 0.4 milliliters. Dependence, 0. Resonance, dormant. Daniel froze. Then he mentally repeated what he'd heard. Source, dependence, resonance. It sounded like instrument readings, like a sonar. Like the control panel on a rescue vessel where every sensor tells you something important if you know how to listen. He knew how to listen to instruments. He'd known how for 20 years. All right, he's a drop of water at the bottom of a dry well. He has 0.4 milliliters. He has some system that considers him a source. Up above, there's an old man and, judging by the second voice, a child. They're about to leave. The well is dry. Everything around him is dry. Mechanic Rowe, you've got a new borehole. We'll figure it out. He spent the rest of the day studying himself. Moving across the rock turned out to be easy. He simply flowed. Going up was harder. G-gravity affected him, just as it did ordinary water. But he could cling to micro cracks in the rock, to rough spots, to remnants of moss. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, he climbed 3 palms width up from the bottom. He was tired. It was a strange sensation for a drop of water, but he couldn't think of another word for it. He rolled back down. He regrouped. He tried again. By evening, he had climbed a meter, and he discovered something important. The wall of the well, 1 meter from the bottom, was damp. Not wet. Damp, a barely noticeable film of moisture in the stone. He pressed his whole body against it, all of his 0.4 milliliters, and he sensed it. There, behind the stone. Deeper, further east. Water, not a river, not a lake. A thin aquifer trapped between 2 layers of clay. About 30 meters from here, it was coming closer to the surface. Much closer. Daniel knew these things. In a past life, he had salvaged sunken structures and cleaned up spills. He knew how water behaved in the ground, how it sought a path downward, how it collects in lenses and pockets, how pressure pushes it upward if you find the right spot. And now he could sense all of this, not through instruments or calculations, but through himself. Literally, with his own body. The water was there, 30 paces to the east, maybe 25, a depth of 4 meters, 5 at most. Any farmer with a shovel could reach it in a day's work, but no one had dug because no one knew. But he knew. The problem was how to tell the old man up there. He was a drop, he had no mouth, no hands, nothing but 0.4 milliliters of transparent body and the stubbornness of a Korean-American engineer who was used to solving problems rather than complaining about the conditions. Night fell quickly. The sky in the round opening of the well grew dark, and stars began to shine. Strange stars, not a single familiar constellation, and 2 moons, one large pale yellow, the second small with a bluish tinge. 2 moons. Daniel stared at them for a long time, looking up from below. He's definitely not in the Yellow Sea. He's not even on Earth. He's not even human. He is water, and he has the night to figure out how to save the old man and the child who will set out in the morning for some place called Melinar and might not make it there. Think, Ro. You've worked with water your whole life. Now you are water yourself. Think, Daniel didn't sleep. Our water droplets probably don't sleep. He spent the night crawling along the walls of the well and gathering moisture. Every drop of dew, every film of dampness on the stone, every tiny bit of condensation from the night air. By dawn, he had nearly 2 milliliters. It's a laughable amount, less than a teaspoon, but he began to sense more. The range of his perception had expanded. The aquifer to the east felt more distinct. A depth of 4.5 meters. The aquifer's flow was slow but steady. The water there was clean. It had passed through sandstone and clay. A natural filter is better than any artificial one. Daniel knew this as surely as he knew his own name. He climbed back up. The 2 milliliters gave him more mass and thus more grip on the rock. He scrambled up the micro cracks like a tiny, transparent slug. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, the well was 7 meters deep. By the time the first ray of sunlight fell into the well's mouth, Daniel had reached the top. He saw the world. A village, if you could call it that. A dozen mud brick houses with flat roofs, half of them with collapsed walls. Dust, gray, cracked earth stretching in every direction. Not a single patch of green. Not one. The road, if that trampled strip could be called a road, led north. To the south, the skeletons of dead trees jutted out. He counted 4 people. An old man with a cane stood by the nearest house, coughing. He coughed for a long time, hoarsely, bending double. Next to him, a girl of about 7 in a patched dress that reached her ankles held 2 bundles, one larger, the other very small. By the house across the way, a woman was feeding a goat the last handful of whatever dry stuff. And another old man was sitting on the ground by the wall with his eyes closed. He might have been asleep, or maybe not. Daniel remembered yesterday's conversation. The old man had said they were going to Melinar. They were planning to leave today. He looked at the old man. The old man was coughing so badly that he wouldn't make it to Melinar. 5 kilometers, maybe 10. With a cough like that in this heat, without water, the girl was 7. The bundles were too heavy for her arms. Daniel made up his mind. He climbed down the outer wall of the well onto the wooden lid of the log cabin. The lid was covered with a thick layer of dust, a perfect surface for writing. He stretched out. He flattened himself into a thin film and began to move across the dust, squeezing out lines. It was difficult, 2 milliliters of water trying to form letters on a board the size of a dining table. But Daniel had been a stubborn man in life, and death hadn't changed that. He wrote 3 characters, not in the Latin alphabet, not in the local script, which he didn't know. He wrote in Korean. 3 characters, dig, east, 30 steps. He didn't know why he chose Korean. Maybe because it was his father's language. Maybe because in another world, Korean seemed foreign enough to look like a sign from above. Or maybe because he'd heard the old man say one word yesterday, just one. When the bucket hit the bottom and the dust settled, the old man muttered something. A short word, a curse, or a prayer, and that word was in Korean. The old man spoke the language of this world, but he uttered the curse in Korean just as Daniel's grandfather used to do, just as his mother did when she burned herself in the kitchen. The word slipped out before his brain could switch to the right language. Daniel waited. The sun was rising. The dust on the log cabin's roof was drying. Its letters were beginning to lose their sharpness. It couldn't hold its shape forever. 2 milliliters were evaporating in the sun at an alarming rate. Come on, old man, come closer. Look down. The little girl approached first. She was carrying bundles toward the road and stopped by the well to adjust a strap. She looked at the lid. She froze. She dropped her bundle. Daniel saw her face. Round, tanned, weather-beaten, her eyes were dark and serious. Too serious for a 7-year-old. She stared at the wet marks on the dusty well cover and didn't scream. She didn't run away. She stood there and looked. Then she turned and called for her grandfather, quietly, without panic. "Grandpa, come here. It says something here." The old man approached. He bent down. He looked at it for a long time. Daniel saw his face change. First, confusion, then recognition, then fear, then something else. The old man straightened up and looked around. The village was empty. The woman with the goat had gone into her house. The second old man by the wall didn't move. The girl's grandfather looked at the letters again. He ran his finger along them without touching them. He read them aloud. Dig, east, 30 steps. He read them in Korean, correctly, with an accent Daniel didn't recognize, but correctly. The old man stood motionless. The girl tugged at his sleeve. She asked what was written there. The old man replied that they were old letters, his great-grandfather's letters, and that they said to dig to the east, 30 steps. The girl asked who had written them. The old man didn't answer. He was looking at the well cover, and Daniel could see fatigue and hope battling in his eyes. The fatigue of an old man who had buried his grandchildren and watched the earth die, and the hope that, in a parched world, is more dangerous than a knife because it can run out like blood. The old man made up his mind. He told the girl to put the knots back. They weren't. He picked up a shovel, a heavy wooden one with an iron tip, and walked east out of the village. Daniel counted his steps. 28, 29, 30. The old man stopped. He looked at the ground beneath his feet. Gray, cracked clay, just like everywhere else. Nothing special. He thrust the shovel into the ground. Daniel crawled along the ground behind him, leaving a dark, wet trail behind him that dried up immediately. He was losing water. Every centimeter of the way cost him precious micro-liters, but he had to be close. The old man dug slowly. A cough stopped him every 10 minutes. The girl brought him a mug of something murky. The old man took a sip and kept digging. The hole was getting deeper. By noon, it was knee-deep. Dry clay, rocks, dust. Not a trace of moisture. Daniel could sense the water below. It was there. 4 meters, maybe 4.5. Keep digging, old man, just a little more. By evening, the hole was waist deep. The old man sat on the edge and couldn't stand up. His hands were shaking. The cough wouldn't stop. The girl stood nearby and looked into the hole. At the bottom of the hole, the soil was a different color, darker. Daniel slid down the side of the hole. He pressed himself against the dark bottom, and he felt it. Moisture. Very close. 1/2 meter. Maybe less. He did the only thing he could. He gathered all he had left, his pitiful 1.5 milliliters, and pressed downward. Through the clay, through the sand, he seeped thinner than a hair through the micro cracks in the rock and touched the aquifer. It was like an electric shock. Water. Real, clean, cool water. Water that had passed through meters of sandstone, filtered by the earth. He touched it, and it became part of him. Not all of it. Just a small portion. A handful. But that handful drew more and more after it. The water rose up through the channel he had carved with his body, as thin as a thread, but wide enough. A wet spot appeared at the bottom of the pit. The girl saw it first. She grabbed her grandfather by the sleeve and pointed down. The old man looked. The wet spot was growing. Water was seeping out of it, slowly, drop by drop, but it was seeping out By the next morning, there was a puddle at the bottom of the pit, clear and transparent, a palm's depth, 12 liters. Daniel felt every milliliter as if it were his own body, a source of 12 liters. 2 people dependent on it. Resonance awakens. The old man knelt at the edge of the pit and looked at the water. The girl scooped some up with her hands. She took a sip. She raised her head. She looked at the puddle, then at the well, then back at the puddle. Daniel gathered a part of himself, a handful of water. He gave it shape, not hands, not a face, just a palm, a watery palm the size of a child's. He raised it above the surface of the puddle. He waved it. The girl didn't scream. She tilted her head to one side and said very seriously, "Grandpa, we have a water uncle now. What's his name?" Daniel trickled down onto the damp sand at the edge of the puddle. He gathered himself, he concentrated, and he wrote a single word with himself, Dan. The girl read it syllable by syllable. Dan? She looked at the palm of water. She nodded. She said her name was Hannah, and that this was Grandpa Pack, and that Uncle Dan was very strange, but his water tasted good. Old Man Pack was still kneeling. Something was running down his cheeks, not water. Tears. He was crying silently, the way people cry who have forgotten how to cry out loud. For the first 3 days after the spring appeared, Daniel worked. He worked just as he had on rescue operations, without a break, with no room for error, without pity for himself. The spring yielded 12 liters a day. That was enough for 2 people. But Daniel knew that 12 liters in an open pit under the sun wasn't really 12 liters. It was 8. 4 would be lost to evaporation. On a rescue vessel, he'd seen people lose water from open tanks and wonder why the level kept dropping. No one thought to cover them. No one thought about evaporation. He made Pa cover the pit. The old man didn't understand why. Daniel couldn't explain it with words because he didn't know how to speak yet. He could only write with water on dry clay. But the clay dried quickly and the letters vanished. Then he came up with something else. He found a flat stone near the pit, a smooth gray stone, about the size of a plate. He urinated on it and wrote a single word, cover. Pack looked at the stone. He looked at the hole. He scratched the back of his head. He fetched an old chicken coop door from the shed and placed it on top. Daniel mentally checked it off his list. Next, the sand filter. The water from the aquifer was clean, but Daniel didn't take anything at face value. He'd worked with water for 20 years and knew that water that looked clean could kill. A slow sand filter is the simplest device in the world. 3 layers, coarse gravel at the bottom, fine sand in the middle, charcoal on top. The water passes through them and becomes safe. The problem was that Daniel couldn't build the filter himself. He had no hands. He had about 15 liters of water and the ability to write on stones. He began teaching Hannah. The girl turned out to be the perfect student, not because she was smart. She was smart, but that wasn't the reason. It was because she accepted what was happening as a given. The water uncle lives in a puddle and writes notes. So that's just how the world works. We need to collect pebbles. So we'll gather pebbles. Daniel wrote instructions on a stone by the spring. Hannah read them aloud to her grandfather. Pak carried them out. By the end of the 3rd day, they had a filter, crooked, skewed, made from a broken pot with 3 layers stuffed together haphazardly. But it worked. Daniel ran water through it and tasted it on himself. He let it run through himself. Every impurity, every particle, every microorganism left a trace in him. He read the water the way an engineer reads instrument readings. The water after the filter was clean. Not perfect, but clean enough not to kill an old man with diseased lungs. On the 4th day, a woman arrived, the very same one who had been feeding the goat. Her name was Miso, 26 years old, a widow. She had lost her husband and 2 infants during the years of drought. She came to the well with an empty jug and stood silently until Pot nodded. She drew some water. She left. She returned an hour later. She placed a clay bowl of rice on the edge of the pit, cooked rice. Daniel didn't know where she'd gotten the rice. Maybe it was her last. Miso set down the bowl and said quietly, "This is for the water spirit." "Thank you for coming back." She spoke to him as if he were a spirit, not as a person, not as an engineer, as something ancient and sacred. Daniel didn't know what to make of it. He's a mechanic, not a spirit, not a god, not an object of worship. He's a guy from San Diego who fixed pumps and loved spicy noodles, but Miso knelt before his puddle and gave thanks. And he felt her gratitude making him stronger. Literally, physically, the spring's flow increased by 1.5 liters per minute. The resonance of dependence. The more people drank its water and believed in it, the stronger it became. Not magic, or maybe magic. In this world, perhaps, they're one and the same. By the 5th day, Daniel had learned to maintain the shape of his palm steadily. He could hold his watery hand above the surface of the spring and keep it there for 10 minutes without letting it fall. Hana talked to his palm as if it were a living person. She told it how her day had gone, that her grandfather was coughing less, that the goat, Miso, had given birth to a kid, but it was weak. That the second old man from the village, the one who sat by the wall, turned out to be alive. His name is Dan. He's just very old and conserving his strength. Daniel listened. He liked listening. In his past life, he'd talked too much and listened too little. His wife used to remind him of that. His wife. He tried not to think about her. Not now. On the 6th day, he began to expand the spring. It was risky. He sent a part of himself deeper into the aquifer. Reconnaissance. Like a diver descending into a flooded compartment. He flowed through cracks in the rock, through porous sandstone, through pockets of moisture. The aquifer was larger than he'd thought. Not a stream, a lens. A water lens trapped between clay and bedrock. Enough to supply a village of 30 people for months, if brought to the surface the right way. Not through a hole in the ground, but through a proper well with reinforced walls and a drainage channel. Daniel began to sketch on a flat rock by the spring, using water to trace lines on the stone, a diagram of the well, depth, diameter, angle of the walls, drainage channel, everything he knew about hydraulic engineering, adapted to Stone Age technology. Kana stood nearby and watched. Then she took out a piece of birch bark and a stick from behind her belt. She began to trace it in crooked letters and slanted lines, but carefully. Daniel watched her and felt something, not in the source, within himself, where his heart used to be. This 7-year-old girl in a patched dress with a birch bark notebook was tracing his engineering drawings and took it more seriously than half the trainees on the rescue vessel. In his mind, he named her the chief engineer of the Taihanok project. By the 7th day, the well was ready, not his work, Pak's work. The old man had been digging for 2 days, taking breaks to cough and sleep. Daniel had been guiding him. He wrote on the rocks, "Deeper, to the left. Stop, go around the rock here." Pak grumbled, but kept digging. The well turned out to be shallow, 3 meters deep, but with reinforced walls, made of stones that Hannah had hauled from the old stream bed behind the village. It had a wooden lid from an old chicken coop that had been moved from the spring, and a drainage trough. The trough was Daniel's idea, and was by Miso. The woman turned out to be a master at working with clay. She molded the trough out of raw clay and fired it in the kiln. It turned out crooked but functional. Water flowed from the well through the trough to a small depression in the ground, the first reservoir. Miso placed a bowl of rice there for the spirit of the water. Daniel relayed through Hana that the spirit of the water doesn't eat rice. Miso replied that it didn't matter. It was the gesture that counted. On the evening of the 7th day, Daniel took inventory. The spring yielded 48 liters. There were 4 dependents, Pak, Hana, Miso, Old Man Dan, who would silently come to fetch water in the mornings and silently leave. The resonance was showing steady growth. 48 liters. He remembered the days when, on a ship, the fire suppression system alone held 200,000 liters. 48 liters is nothing, a drop in the desert. Literally, but it's a living drop, a growing one, and has 4 people who drink from it every day. On the 8th day, Daniel decided to check out the village. All he knew about Tekenka was what he'd seen from the edge of the well: a dozen houses, dust, dead trees. 34 residents, the old man had said on the first day, but Daniel saw only 4. Where were the other 30? He separated a drop from himself, a small one, 5 milliliters. It was a strange sensation, like tearing off a piece of skin. It didn't hurt, but it was noticeable. The drop was him, a part of him. Through it, he sensed everything. He saw, he heard. He felt the temperature and composition of the air. The drop crept along the gutter, across the dry earth. Through the cracks in the clay, Daniel guided it like a drone. The first house, empty, the roof had collapsed. Inside, sand and goat bones. The second house, empty, the door had been torn from its hinges. Someone had taken the door with them when they left. The third house, a smell. The drop had no nose, but Daniel sensed the composition of the air through it. Urea, ammonia. Someone was alive inside. He rolled in through the crack under the door. A woman, an old woman, lying on a mat, a jug nearby, empty. She hadn't drunk anything for at least a day. Daniel brought the drop back to himself. He dripped onto a rock. He wrote to Hannah, third house, an old woman. No water, bring some. Hannah ran off. She returned an hour later. She said the old woman's name was Bo. She hadn't gotten out of bed for 3 days. Hannah gave her some water and left the jug there. Daniel sent the drop on its way. Fourth house, a family, a man in his 40s with an emaciated face, a woman about the same age, 2 children, a boy of about 10, and a younger girl. They were sitting against the wall and didn't move, conserving energy, just like old Dan, like everyone in this village. The 5th house, empty. 6th house, Mizo. She was kneading clay by the stove, making a second gutter without being told. She'd decided on her own that 1 gutter wasn't enough. Daniel mentally gave her a thumbs up. By evening, he'd walked through the entire village. Of the 34 residents, 19 remained. The rest had gone to Melinar, or had died, or both. 19 people. 8 of them don't leave their homes. 3 have children. 2 elderly people are on the brink. 1 man looked healthy, but Daniel could sense his sweat from a drop's distance. His salt balance is disrupted. Early stage of chronic dehydration. The man walks and works, but his kidneys are already at their limit. 48 liters a day. 19 people. 2.5 liters per person. The minimum survival requirement in a hot climate is 3 liters. For heavy labor, 5. It's not enough. He needs more water. Daniel dove into the aquifer, deeper than before. He was looking for branches, side pockets, cracks in the bedrock through which he could reach deeper reserves. He found them. After 2 hours of underground exploration, a second aquifer, 12 meters deeper. Between them lay a dense layer of clay, impenetrable to ordinary water. But he wasn't ordinary water. He was the source. He seeped through, like a thin thread through the clay, millimeter by millimeter. It took all night. By dawn on the 9th day, it had broken through to the second aquifer, and the volume jumped. The source, 120 liters. 4 dependents. The buzz is growing. 120 liters, 6 liters per person if you count all 19. But there are still only 4 who depend on it. The other 15 didn't know about it. They were drinking from their own reserves, waiting for death or a miracle. Daniel asked Hannah to go around to all the houses, to tell them that there's water in the well on the eastern outskirts. There's water, clean water, free. Hannah went. She returned 2 hours later. She said 4 people came right away, a family from the 4th house. The man filled 2 jugs and left without saying a word. His wife bowed to the well. The other 3 refused. They said it was a trap, that the water spirits lure people in and then demand payment. 2 didn't open the door. Old woman Bo came on her own, barely able to stand. She drank her fill. She told Hannah that if the water spirit wanted her soul, it could have it. She didn't care. Hannah replied very seriously that Uncle Dan doesn't take souls. He takes empty jugs and returns them full. Daniel listened to this conversation through the drop of water left by the well and felt a strange sensation, pride in the 7-year-old girl who was explaining to an 80-year-old woman how the water supply worked. By the 12th day, he had 200 liters and 11 dependents. 8 out of 19 still hadn't shown up, but 11 were enough for growth. The resonance was working. Every person who drank his water left a mark on him, not a physical one, something else. Like warmth, like a connection. He could sense each of them. He knew when Pot coughed. He knew when Hannah fell asleep. He knew when Miso cried into her pillow at night. The 12th day was a turning point. Miso came to the pond that evening. By then, Daniel had already expanded the spring into a small pond, a meter in diameter, shallow. But a real pond with water in a parched village is a miracle. Miso sat on the edge and began to speak. She spoke for a long time about her husband, about her children, about how her first child died because she didn't have clean water for the formula, about the second one, who lived for 3 months, about her husband, who went to Melinar for water and never returned, about how she'd been cooking for the whole village out of nothing for 2 years, about how she'd forgotten how to sleep, about the migraine that hadn't gone away since her second child died. Daniel listened silently, like a drop on the edge of a pond. When Miso fell silent, he did what he did best. He solved a technical problem, a migraine caused by dehydration, chronic dehydration plus an electrolyte deficiency. He gathered some water, a small amount, a glass. He added a pinch of mineral salts from the aquifer. They were in the rock: calcium, magnesium, potassium. He literally filtered them out of the rock and dissolved them in water in the right proportions. He added a tiny hint of that herbal flavor provided by the roots in the topsoil. The result was a solution, not medicine, just the right kind of water, balanced. He used to prepare this for dehydrated sailors after spa surgery. He slid the glass down the chute toward Miso. She looked at it, picked it up. She drank it. She sat there for a minute. Her face changed, not right away. Gradually, the furrow between her eyebrows smoothed out. Her shoulders relaxed. She said quietly, "My head doesn't hurt. For the first time in 2 years, my head doesn't hurt." Daniel had written on the stone, "This is for you, only for you. Drink it every evening." Miso stared at the wet letters on the stone. She pressed the mug to her chest, and she cried, not the way Pak cried, not silently, loudly, out loud. The way people cry when they can finally allow themselves to. On the 14th day, what Daniel had both been waiting for and fearing at the same time happened. People came from the neighboring village of Onso, 4 of them, a man and 3 women. One was carrying a child in her arms. They'd been walking for half a day along the dry road and looked the way people look when they're walking for the last time. Sunken eyes, chapped lips. Their movements were slow and economical, like those of people who know that every step costs them moisture. The man approached Pak and asked if it was true that there was water in Tikanka. Pak nodded. The man asked to buy a jug. Pak said the water was free. The man didn't believe him. He stood there waiting for a catch. Hana brought him a jug, full and clean. The man took it with both hands. He looked at the water. He sniffed it. He tasted it. He looked at Hana. His lips trembled. He sat down on the ground right where he was standing and began to drink. Slowly, in small sips. Daniel watched through a crack in the well wall. The man was drinking correctly, in small sips. So he knew you shouldn't drink quickly after being dehydrated for a long time. So he'd lost people because of it. He knew because he'd seen someone die from drinking too quickly. The women gave the child some water. The baby was about a year old. He wasn't crying. Children in that condition don't cry. They don't have enough moisture left for tears. Daniel prepared a solution, the same one he'd used for Miso, but weaker proportions for a child. Through a straw, 1 drop per minute. Hana held the straw. She already knew what to do. Daniel had taught her on the 3rd day. He showed her the proportions. He carved them on a stone. A pinch of salt per palmful of water, a grain of sugar if available, a drop of juice from any edible herb. Slowly, very slowly, Hana remembered it the first time. 2 hours later, the child began to cry. That was a good sign. Tears meant there was moisture. The child's mother stood nearby, watching the 7-year-old girl who was saving her son through a straw filled with the solution. She asked who had taught her. Hana replied, "Uncle D, and he lives in the well. 4 from Onso remained." The spring's flow had jumped to 280 liters, 15 dependents. The resonance was beginning. Daniel felt it like a hum, a low, steady hum, like an engine running on a ship, a vibration that signaled the system was alive and gaining power. On the 16th day, he decided it was time to expand. The pond by the well held 200 liters. He kept the remaining 80 liters in the aquifer underground as a reserve. But people needed more than just drinking water. They needed water for cooking, for washing, for Miso the goat and her kid, for the garden, if anyone decided to plant anything at all. Daniel began building a canal. Not by himself, of course. He was just a drop in the bucket. But he knew how to draw blueprints. He knew how to plan. And he had Hana, who translated his blueprints into human language. A canal from the well to the old garden behind Miso's house, 30 meters. A slope of 2 centimeters per meter. Gravity-fed. No pumps, no magic. Just simple gravity and precise calculations. Pak did the digging. A man from Onso named Tae helped. They dug for 3 days. Daniel gave directions via notes scrawled on stones. Hannah ran back and forth between them with a birch bark notebook. Deeper here, straighter, turn left, 2 degrees. Hannah translated. Uncle says to dig deeper, right here, and turn. No, another turn. Daniel admired her patience. 7 years. She'd been running back and forth in the heat between the old man and the water source, and she never once complained. On the 19th day, the canal was ready. Daniel let the water flow. A thin stream ran along the clay trough from the well, across Pei's yard, past old woman Bo's house, to Miso's garden. Miso stood by the garden and watched as the water filled the first furrow. The earth was dead, gray, cracked. The water soaked in instantly, like a sponge. Miso knelt down next to the furrow. She touched the wet earth. She scooped up a handful, clenched it in her fist. The mud trickled through her fingers. She said she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen mud. Real wet mud. The 20th day, morning, Daniel discovered something new. He could speak, not with his mouth, not with his voice, through the water. When the water flowed through the gutter, it murmured, and he could control that murmur, change the tone, the rhythm, the frequency. Sounds came out, not words yet, but sounds that, if you wanted to, could be taken for a whisper. He practiced all day. By evening, he'd managed 1 word, Hannah. The girl was sitting by the gutter, drawing with a stick in the wet earth. She heard her name. She looked up. She looked at the water. The water was murmuring. And in the murmur was her name. She wasn't scared. She smiled broadly. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, she said that Uncle Dan had finally started talking, that it was about time. Otherwise, writing on stones takes too long, and the letters come out crooked. Daniel laughed. The water in the trough gurgled and splashed. Hannah said it was a terrible laugh. He needed to practice. She would tell jokes, and he would learn to laugh properly. On the 20th day, toward evening, another event took place. More people approached the village. Not for 12. From the Ovkoro, west of Takanka. Rumors had spread. There was water in Takanka. Free water. 12 people stood at the entrance to the village and waited. Among them were 6 children. Daniel counted them. 15 dependents plus 12 newcomers, that's 27. 280 liters, just over 10 liters per person. It'll be enough, barely, but enough, if he increases production from the second aquifer. If he builds a second filter, if he expands the pond, if. He's an engineer. Engineers deal with ifs. Pak welcomed them silently. He showed them the well. He showed them the trough. He showed them the pond. The people from Koro looked at the water as if it were a miracle. One of the women dropped to her knees and began to pray. Through a droplet by the pond, Daniel saw her face. Awe, fear, hope. That very dangerous hope that in a parched world cuts like a knife. The spring, 310 liters. Dependence, 27. Resonance, the first surge. Daniel felt it with his whole body. Not painful, not pleasant. Like a snap, like shifting gears. Something inside him changed. He began to sense further. Not 30 meters around the well, but 200. 300. He felt every stone, every crack in the ground, every root of a dead tree within a radius of 300 meters. And he felt people, not as data, as a presence, warm, soft clusters of life on his dry, cracked earth. 27 clusters. 27 people who drank his water and were alive because he had decided not to die. No, not like that. He was already dead. They were alive because he had decided to keep working. On the evening of the 20th day, Hannah sat by the pond and told him how to set up a life for the new people. They had no homes. But there were empty houses in the village. 4 houses were intact. 2 could be repaired. The roofs needed patching. They needed clay. There was clay. We need water for the clay. There's water. Uncle Dan, you'll give us water for the clay, won't you? Daniel replied with a murmur. Just one word. Yes, Hannah nodded. She wrote it down in her birch bark notebook. Water for the clay. Approved. She underlined it. Daniel watched her across the surface of the pond. The 7-year-old girl kept track of the village's water resources in a birch bark notebook, and she did it better than some of the managers he'd known in his past life. He thought of Pak. The old man was coughing less, drinking clean water regularly. Her body was recovering slowly but surely. He thought of Miso. Her migraines hadn't returned. She drank her solution every evening. She'd started smiling. Not often, but she'd started. He thought of old woman Bo, who now came to the pond every morning and sat on a rock, silently. She just sat by the water, as if it were enough for her to know the water was nearby. Source, 310 liters. Dependence, 27. Resonance active. 3 weeks ago, he was a pea. A transparent, trembling pea at the bottom of a dead well. 0.4 milliliters, and now he is 310 liters. A pond, a well, a canal, a trough, a filter. 27 people. A 7-year-old chief engineer, and the first word spoken aloud over the murmur of the water. Mechanic row. The first well is working. Let's move on to the expansion. On the 23rd day, Daniel realized he needed a map. Not a map of the world, a map of the valley. He could sense the ground within a radius of 300 meters, but that wasn't enough. Somewhere beyond the limits of his perception lay 3 more villages that the refugees from Koro had spoken of. The village of Malo to the south, the village of Tes to the southeast, and the village of Hagin in the northwest, between Tihank and the road to Melinar. 5 villages in a single valley, all dying, all without water. Daniel asked Hannah to find someone who knew the area. Hannah brought Tai. The man from Onso turned out to be a former shepherd. Before the drought, he had herded goats all over the valley. He knew every rock, every ravine, every dry riverbed. Daniel spent 3 hours with him. Through Hannah, he asked questions. Where was the bed of the old stream? Where did it flow before the drought? Where was the lowest point in the valley? Where was the rock outcrop? Where was the clay? And where was the sandstone? To answer in detail, he sketched with a stick on the ground. Hannah traced his drawings into a birch bark notebook. By evening, Daniel had a map. It was crooked, out of proportion, but usable. And on that map, he saw what he was looking for. The valley was shaped like a shallow bowl. Tichenok on the eastern edge, Mello on the southern edge, Tis on the southeastern slope, Hagen in the northwest, Koro in the west. And in the center of the valley, a dry riverbed, Little Selmar, a stream that had been a river 7 years ago. Not a large river, but enough to feed 5 villages. It had dried up. Why? Daniel dove into the aquifer and headed west. It was risky. The farther he got from the well, the weaker the connection to the main body of water became. At a distance of 100 meters, he felt like a diver on a long hose. At 200, like a diver on a long hose in murky water. At 300, he could hardly see anything. But he kept going, like a thin thread through the aquifer, meter by meter, through sandstone, through clay, through pockets of barren rock where there wasn't a single drop. 400 meters from the well, he found it, a wall. Not made of stone, not made of clay. Artificial. Someone had driven a barrier into the aquifer, a clay embankment mixed with something else. He tasted it. Through himself. Each substance left a trace within him. Clay, limestone, and a third component. Bitter, caustic, inorganic, poison. 7 years ago, someone had poisoned and blocked the aquifer intentionally. professionally. So that water from the western part of the valley wouldn't reach the eastern part, so that little Selmar would dry up, so that 5 villages would begin to die. Daniel recoiled from the poisonous wall. Part of his body touched the poison, and he felt nauseous. Not human nausea, aquatic nausea. A murk rose within him. Contamination. He lost about a liter. Just lost it. The contaminated part of his body died off like gangrenous tissue. It fell away as a murky clot and seeped into the rock. He returned to the well. He gathered himself. He reflected. The well in Tikanka had been poisoned on purpose 7 years ago. The aquifer was blocked by an artificial wall laced with poison. Little Selmar had dried up, not because of a drought. There had been a drought, but the river hadn't died from it. Someone had killed the river on purpose. Daniel lay by the pond and thought, who stands to gain? An old question, always a valid one. Who stands to gain from leaving 5 villages in the valley without water? The answer is obvious. Whoever sells water. The water house, the devouring house. Tay confirmed it that evening through Kana. 7 years ago, people from Melinar came to the valley. They said they were inspecting the wells. They went from village to village. They did something by the stream. A month later, the stream dried up. 2 months later, the wells ran dry. 6 months later, children began to die. The devouring house, they poisoned the aquifer to create dependency so that the peasants would buy water from them. At the price of blood, Daniel curled up in the pond. His entire mass, 310 liters, shrank into a dense, heavy ball at the bottom. If he'd had fists, he would have clenched them until his knuckles turned white. Instead, the water in the pond darkened by half a shade. Hannah noticed. She came over. She asked what had happened. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then, in a murmur, he said 2 words. The well was poisoned. Hannah didn't understand at first. Then she did. Her expression changed. The 7-year-old girl looked at the pond and said very quietly, Mom drank from that well. Mom drank from the poisoned well. Daniel knew. The water fever that had killed Hannah's mother wasn't a fever at all. It was poisoning, chronic poisoning from a toxin in the aquifer. Devouring had killed Hannah's mother, and she wasn't the only one. Miso's 2 babies. Miso's husband, who had gone to fetch water and never returned. 15 residents of Tihanka, who had disappeared over the course of 7 years. The children from Onso, Koro, Mello, Tess, and Hagen. None of them died from the drought. They died from poison and greed. Daniel made a decision. He wouldn't just provide water for the village. He would restore the aquifer. He would remove the poisonous barrier. He would bring water back to Little Selmar, and he would do it in such a way that no water house would ever again be able to cut off the water supply to these people. But first, he needed to become bigger, much bigger, 310 liters as a pond. He needed a river. On the 25th day, Daniel began an operation he mentally dubbed the breakthrough. The toxic wall in the aquifer stretched 400 meters from north to south. It blocked the entire eastern sector of the valley, cutting it off from the main underground flow. According to Daniel's calculations, there was a huge reserve of water behind the wall, thousands of liters, maybe tens of thousands. The water had been accumulating for 7 years, pressing against the artificial barrier with no way out. It was an engineering problem. To bypass the wall, not break through it. Don't touch the poison. Find a way around it. From below or above, Daniel dove deeper than ever before. The third aquifer, 18 meters below the surface. It was cold here. The water in the rock was icy. The pressure was intense. He squeezed through micro cracks in the bedrock and felt like a diver in a flooded cave. Dark, cramped. One wrong turn and you're stuck. But he couldn't get stuck. He was water. Water always finds a way. At a depth of 20 meters, the bedrock had a fault. An old one. A geological one. A finger-wide crack in the rock, stretched from east to west, below the toxic wall. Much lower, the wall plunged 6 meters into the clay. The fault was at 20, 14 meters to spare. Daniel made his way along the fault, westward, slowly, conserving every milliliter. He was far from the main body. The connection was weak. If he lost too much water along the way, he wouldn't be able to return. 500 meters from the well, he emerged beyond the toxic wall, and he sensed water. Lots of water. The aquifer behind the wall was overflowing. The pressure was immense. 7 years of buildup. The water was bursting to get out, but the wall held. Daniel set to work. He widened the crack, not with force, with water seeping into the rock's micropores, freezing, expanding, thawing. It seeped in again. It froze again. Cycle after cycle. Weathering accelerated 1,000-fold. Each cycle made the crack a little wider, by a millimeter, by 2. It took 2 days. He didn't come up to the surface. He didn't answer Hannah, who was sitting by the pond and calling for him. He didn't write on the rocks. He worked. Life continued on the surface. Pak and Tay were digging a second well according to the blueprints Daniel had left before his descent. Miso was cooking for 27 people. Hannah distributed the water according to a schedule written in a birch bark notebook. Drinking water in the morning, household water in the afternoon, water for the garden in the evening. Reserve water at night. The girl kept track of everything like an adult. Better than an adult, because for her it wasn't work but a responsibility to Uncle Dan, who had gone underground and said he'd be back. On the 27th day at 4 in the morning, the crack reached a critical width, 5 centimeters. Enough? Daniel stepped back. He pulled his body out of the channel, and the pressure did the rest. Water from the overflowing western aquifer gushed into the crack, not quickly, not like a dam bursting. More like turning on a faucet. A powerful, steady stream of cold, clear water flowed along the deep fault line from west to east. Beneath the toxic walls, past it, and began to fill the eastern aquifer. Daniel rose to the surface. He emerged into the pond. He gathered himself, and he felt the earth beneath Tikank begin to change, slowly. The water from below was raising the groundwater level, centimeter by centimeter. In a week, it would reach a depth of 2 meters. In a month, the wells in the valley would begin to fill on their own. In 3 months, little Selmar would flow. Hannah was waiting for him by the pond. He surfaced, raised his water-soaked hand, and waved. She exhaled. She said he'd been gone for 2 days, and she thought something was wrong with him. Daniel replied in a murmur that he was fine, that he'd found the way, that the water was flowing. Hannah took out her birch bark notebook and wrote it down. Uncle Dan is back. The water is flowing. She underlined it twice. The spring yields 400 liters. New water was coming up from below and flowing into it. It was growing, not through effort, not by collecting dew drop by drop. It simply grew like a tree that had taken root in good soil. 27 dependents. But that would soon change. On the 28th day, more people arrived. From Mellow in the south, 7 people. From Hagen in the northwest, 9. Rumors spread faster than water. There's water in Takanka. Clean, free. A water spirit lives in the well. People made their way to it across the dry land, carrying children and the elderly in their arms. And Daniel welcomed them all. The spring reached 600 liters by the end of the first month. 43 dependents. The response was steady growth. The pond had to be expanded. Then again. Then Daniel stopped expanding the pond and began to think on a larger scale. He needed a system. Not just one pond and one trough, a system of canals, a centralized water supply for 5 villages. He drew up plans at night, using water on large flat stones that Tay had hauled from the old riverbed. Diagrams, calculations, gradients, diameters, intake points, discharge points, filtration stations, everything he knew about hydraulic engineering adapted to Stone Age materials. Clay, stone, wood, rope, nothing else. Hannah traced his drawings into a birch bark notebook. The notebook ran out of pages. Miso sewed her a new one out of goatskin. Hannah said thank you and asked for 2. One for the drawings, the other for keeping track of the water. The second month began with a girl falling into Daniel's pond, or rather, next to the pond. She appeared at dawn on the 34th day. She was walking along the road from the north, staggering. Her clothes were torn. There was a wound on her left shoulder. Not fresh, about 3 days old. It was inflamed and oozing pus. She made it to the pond and fell face first into the wet clay at the water's edge. Not into the water, but right next to it, and didn't get back up. Daniel assessed the situation from a short distance away. A young woman, about 19 years old. Dark hair, tangled and dirty. Her clothes aren't peasant attire. The fabric is thin and once expensive, white. On her belt hangs an empty quiver from a short bow. The bow is either lost or has been taken from her. Second-degree dehydration. The wound on her shoulder is infected. She has a high fever. If she isn't given water and her wound isn't treated, she'll die by evening. Daniel sprang into action. He brought the water up to her face. A thin stream trickled down the clay to her cracked lips. The girl didn't react. He gathered more. He formed a water palm. The first one was the size of a real man's hand. He lifted her head. He poured water into her mouth, slowly, drop by drop. Just as Hannah had taught him with the child from Onso, the girl coughed. She opened her eyes, gray, angry, even in her half-delirium. She saw the water hand holding her head. She flinched. She tried to crawl away. She collapsed back down. Daniel didn't let go. He held her. He poured water into her mouth, drop by drop. Rehydration solution, salt, minerals, everything she needed. Hannah came running. A minute later, she saw the girl. She saw the watery hand. She wasn't scared. She ran to get Miso. Miso came with rags and a pot of hot water. She saw the wound. She pursed her lips. She began to wash it. Daniel helped. Clean water, absolutely clean. Filtered through him, more sterile than surgical solution. He poured it in a thin stream into the wound while Miso cleaned the edges. The girl groaned through clenched teeth. She didn't scream. By noon, she had come to her senses. She sat by the pond, wrapped in a blanket that Pa had brought. She drank in small sips from a mug. She looked at the pond, at the gutter, at the people, at the 7-year-old girl with the birch bark notebook. Daniel watched through the surface of the water. The girl was tense as a bowstring. Her eyes darted about. She was assessing escape routes, counting the people, a professional habit. Military or hunting? Hanny approached her. She asked her name. The girl paused. Then she answered, Yuna. Hannah nodded. She said her name was Hannah and that the water uncle was named Dan, and that Yuna shouldn't drink too fast because Uncle Dan says it makes you feel sick. Yuna looked at the pond, then at Hannah. She asked what water uncle meant. Hannah explained, simply, without any mysticism, Uncle Dan lives in the water. He is the water. He appeared in the well a month ago. He helps. He's good, but strange, and sometimes he says words she doesn't understand. Yuna stared silently at the pond. Daniel raised a hand from the water, a watery, transparent hand, and waved. Yuna didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. She squinted and said calmly, "The living spring." She said it as a technical term, not as a legend, as a fact she'd been taught. She knew what it was. She knew Yuna Han, the runaway youngest daughter of House Varing, the very same house that poisoned the aquifer, the very same house that sold water to the peasants at a blood price. She didn't tell this right away. 3 days later, when the wound began to heal and she was able to walk, she told Miso because Miso didn't ask questions, but simply fed her 3 times a day and changed her bandage. Yuna said she had run away from her father's house, that her father wanted to marry her off to an old man from a neighboring house in order to gain control over the aquifer. That she refused, that her father locked her in her room, that she jumped out of a second-story window, that the guards found her and shot her in the shoulder with an arrow, that she ran for 3 days across dry land without water or a weapon. Miso listened in silence. Then she asked one thing. Did Yuna know that her father had poisoned their well? Yuna froze. She looked at Miso, at her hands, calloused, work-worn. The hands of a woman who had buried her husband and 2 children. Yuna said she didn't know. Miso nodded. She stood up. She left. Una sat alone by the pond. Daniel was silent. He didn't murmur. He didn't raise his palms. He waited. Una spoke an hour later, addressing the water. She said that all her life she'd been taught that water is a commodity, that people are worth as much as they can pay for a jug, that the poor die because they don't know how to earn a living. She believed that. She believed it until the day before yesterday. Then a 7-year-old girl with a birch bark notebook gave her a drink for free from the pond where the water spirit lives, and didn't even ask where she was from. Daniel raised a hand out of the water, a small one, the size of a child's. He scooped up some water from the pond, a tiny drop. He raised it to Una's face. The drop trembled on his transparent palm. Transparent, clear, the size of a fingernail. Una stared at it. Daniel murmured, "That's as much as you drank for breakfast. That's how much a person is worth." Una didn't answer. She stood up. She went into the house they'd assigned her. She didn't go out for 3 days. On the 3rd day, she went out. Silently, she picked up a shovel. She walked to the canal that Tay and Pak were digging. She began to dig. She didn't say a word. She just dug all day long. By the end of the 2nd month, the valley was changing. Not quickly, not miraculously, through hard daily labor. The canals stretched from Taihang to Anso and Koro. Clay troughs fired in the miso kiln, a slope of 2 centimeters per meter, gravity flow. Daniel monitored every meter. Through the drainage holes, spaced along the route, he could see every dip, every crack, every spot where the water might seep into the sand. Hana ran back and forth between the work crews with a notepad. T commanded the diggers. Una dug silently alongside the men, and no one asked her any questions because Miso had quietly told everyone not to. Pak was coughing less. Clean water and regular hydration were doing their job. He was still old and frail. But now he could walk from his house to the well without stopping. For an 80-year-old man who had lived on dirty water for 7 years, that was a lot. By the 40th day, the canal to Anso was ready. 200 meters. Water began to flow. The 3 families remaining in Anso watched as water ran through the dried-up trough next to their homes. Real water. Clean water. An old woman from Anso stepped out onto her porch and stared at the trough, filled with water for 10 minutes, without moving. Then she sank to the ground and began slapping her palms against her knees. Not out of grief, out of something greater than grief and greater than joy. The spring had surpassed 1,000 liters. 51 people depended on it. The resonance was a steady, powerful hum within Daniel's body. He could feel each and every one of them. 51 warm presences, 51 points on his map. And along with them, he felt himself. Not a drop, not a pond, a system. A living, functioning hydraulic system with wells, filters, channels, and reservoirs. The engineer inside him rejoiced. They began work on the 2nd channel to Koro on the 42nd day. This one was more complicated. Koro lay to the west, and between them was a stretch of bedrock. A surface channel wouldn't work. A detour was needed, or a pipe through the rock. You can't make a pipe in the Stone Age, but Daniel came up with something else. He found a natural channel in the rock, a crack, not a deep one like the one he'd used to bypass the poisonous wall, a shallow one, as wide as a palm. It stretched for 50 meters. If they widened the bottom and lined it with clay, it would make an aqueduct, a natural stone aqueduct. Miso lined the bottom with clay. She seared it with torches. The result was a smooth, watertight channel in the rock. Daniel let the water flow. It ran over the rock, through the clay-lined channel, past the rocky outcrop, and emerged on the other side, to Koro. The people from Koro stood at the channel's exit and watched. Then the man who had led them to Tianuk a month ago dipped his hand into the water. He held it there. He pulled it out. He looked at his wet palm and said it was a miracle. Through a drop of water in the channel, Daniel heard that word, miracle. No, it's hydraulic engineering, slope and gravity, and properly fired clay. But for people who hadn't seen running water in 7 years, it was a miracle. And he didn't argue. On the 45th day, Miso planted the seeds. Daniel didn't know where she'd gotten them. She'd been saving them. For 7 years, she'd kept the seeds in a dry pot under her bed. She'd been waiting. She planted them in the garden by the canal. She watered them. 3 days later, sprouts appeared, green, alive. The first sprouts in the valley in 2 years. Miso stood over them and cried, quietly. Silently, tears dripped onto the sprouts. Daniel thought that these tears were his, too. They were made of his water. The water he had given to Miso returned to the earth through her eyes. The cycle. Beautiful. On the 48th day, Daniel tried something new. He knew he could form water limbs, a palm, an arm up to the elbow. But the human body was more complicated. He started with the head. He gathered the water above the pond into a sphere. He added features, a nose, a chin, ears. It didn't turn out well. Like a snowman. Hannah said it looked like a pumpkin with ears. Yuna snorted. For the first time in 2 weeks, Daniel tried again and again. Every evening he practiced, shaping a face, a body, arms, legs. The water wouldn't hold its shape. It's heavy. It flows. It obeys gravity. To maintain a human figure requires constant effort, like balancing on one leg, only with your whole body. On the 52nd day, he succeeded, not for long, for 30 seconds. He stood above the pond, at full height, the figure of a man made of transparent water, faceless, without details. Just a silhouette, but standing, on 2 legs. Hannah looked up at him. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said, "Uncle Dan, you forgot your clothes." The figure crashed back into the pond, splashing water in all directions. Yuna, who was standing by the canal with a shovel, got a jet of water in her face. She called him a water idiot. Miso covered her mouth with her hand, but Daniel could see she was laughing for the first time ever. Beep. Day 53, evening. A man approached Tihank. Just one. Not a refugee, not a peasant. Clean clothes, boots, a bag with papers, and an inkwell on his belt. He stopped at the village entrance and looked around. He saw a canal with flowing water. He saw a pond. He saw green sprouts in Miso's vegetable garden. He took a piece of paper out of his bag. He began to write. Te approached him. He asked who he was and what he wanted. The man replied that he was a tax collector for the water district of House Varane. He explained that he had learned of an illegal water source on territory controlled by the house, that all water on the lands of House Varane was the property of the house, that using water without a license carried a fine of 20 silver coins per family or forced labor in the quarries. T remained silent. Mapak remained silent. Miso clenched her fists. Yuna stood around the corner of the house and watched the collector. Her face turned pale. She recognized the uniform. She knew this man, or people like him. Hannah approached the collector. She looked up at him. She said that the water belonged to Uncle Dan, and that Uncle Dan doesn't take silver coins. The collector looked at the girl. He asked who Uncle Dan was. Hannah pointed to the pond. The collector looked at the pond. A watery hand slowly rose from the pond. A large one, the size of an adult man's hand. The hand waved at the collector. The collector dropped the inkwell. Then he turned around and walked back down the road, quickly, without looking back. The collector returned 10 days later, not alone. 2 others came with him. A woman in a dark hooded cloak with the symbol of the temple of the first drop on her chest, and a man in a leather vest with 2 short swords at his belt, a mercenary. Daniel got a good look at the woman in the cloak by the roadside, about 30 years old, a sharp face, attentive, intelligent eyes, a chain around her neck with a drop-shaped pendant, a priestess or an inquisitor of the temple. The man with the swords was easier to read, broad-shouldered. A scar across his left cheek. A professional, not an elite warrior. An ordinary mid-level mercenary. Dangerous to peasants. Not dangerous to 1,000 liters of clean water. The collector stopped by the pond. This time he wasn't alone. He had backup. He straightened up. He took out a piece of paper. He began to read aloud the decree from the House of Varane regarding illegal water use. A woman in a cloak stood nearby, looking at the pond. Not at the collector, at the pond. Her eyes were shining. She sensed something. A mage, a water mage. Daniel knew this from the way she looked at the water, not as a liquid, but as a living being, because to a water mage, water is a living being. Hana stood by the well, watching the strangers. Yuna stood behind Miso's house, holding a shovel, not for digging. Tay and Pak were by the canal. Miso was inside the house with the children. Daniel assessed the situation. One mercenary, one collector, one water mage, against a village of 51 people. The mercenary was dangerous. The mage was unpredictable. The collector was insignificant. Daniel didn't want to fight. He never wanted to fight. In his past life, he'd fought 3 times. He'd lost all 3 times. He was an engineer, not a fighter. But he wasn't human anymore. He was the source, and he had 1,000 liters. He started small. He lifted a watery arm out of the pond, then a second one, then a head, a silhouette, faceless, without features, but full length. 1.5 meters of transparent, shimmering water standing on the surface of the pond. The collector took 3 steps back. The mercenary placed his hand on his sword. The woman in the cloak stepped forward. She looked at the watery silhouette, and her lips moved. She was counting. She analyzed. She tried to understand what was before her. Daniel spoke. Through the murmur, his voice was like a stream, quiet but clear. He said his name was Dan. That the water belonged to him, that he wasn't selling it. He was giving it away, that the decree of House Varain did not apply to him, that the people in this valley did not need a license to drink. The collector flushed. He began to talk about laws, about the rights of the house, about punishment. The mercenary took a step forward and placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. The woman in the cloak raised her hand. She stopped them both. She looked at Daniel, at his watery body, at his transparent hands, at the pond from which he had emerged. She asked one thing: is he the source, the real living source? Daniel answered that he was. The woman closed her eyes. She opened them. There was something new in them. Not fear, not greed. Hunger. The hunger of a scientist awaiting the discovery she'd spent her entire life seeking. She introduced herself, Soren May, a water mage of the Temple of the First Drop, sent to investigate rumors of an imposter water spirit in the Takanka Valley. She was supposed to expose him or destroy him, but she stood before a living source, before a creature that, according to all the temple's texts, had vanished centuries ago. Before the miracle she had been sent to disprove, Daniel looked at her through watery eyes without pupils and saw glasses on her nose, made of mountain crystal, thin, homemade. The lenses were uneven. She'd made them herself because her eyesight was poor and because she wanted to see better than anyone else. He spoke to her through the murmur, quietly, just to her. He asked what she knew about why water flows downhill. Soren blinked. She answered, "The will of the first drop, a dogma of the temple. Water flows downward because the first drop fell from the sky and set the direction." Daniel laughed. The water in the pond rippled. He said one word, "Gravity." Soren frowned. She didn't know that word. Daniel explained over the murmur of the water, slowly, simply. The earth pulls water toward itself, not will, not the spirit, a force, a measurable, predictable, constant force. Every object with mass attracts another object with mass. Water is heavy. The earth is heavier. Water flows toward the earth, downward, always downward. Not because someone ordered it, because that's how the world works. Soren listened. Her face changed. Like Pak's face when he saw the water at the bottom of the pit. Not belief, recognition, as if she had always known this, but lacked the words. The collector was shouting something about laws. The mercenary stood with his sword at the ready. Soren didn't hear them. She asked a second question. "Why does hot water rise and cold water sink?" Daniel answered. "Density. Hot water is lighter. Cold water is heavier. Light things rise. Heavy things sink. Convection." Soren took off her glasses. She wiped them. She put them back on. Her hands were shaking. She asked a third question. Why doesn't salt water freeze as quickly as fresh water? Daniel answered. Salt prevents water molecules from forming a crystalline lattice. It takes more cold to overcome this obstacle. Soren stood motionless. In 5 minutes, this watery silhouette had explained more to her than the temple had in 10 years of training. She turned to the collector. She said that the investigation was over, that the spirit of water in the Tihanka Valley posed no threat and did not violate the temple's canons. The collector began to object. Soren turned to him and said that if he didn't shut up, she would report to the temple that House Farain was obstructing a sacred investigation. And that meant 30 years in the quarries for the collector himself. The collector fell silent. The mercenary took his hand off his sword. He looked at Soren, at her watery silhouette. He shrugged. He turned and walked down the road. The collector ran after him. Soren stayed behind. She stood by the pond and watched Daniel. He sank back into the water. He cupped his hand, a small one. He reached out toward it, scooped up water from the pond. Concentrated. He formed a lens, a water lens, thin and perfectly round. Held in shape by surface tension reinforced by his will. He raised it to the light. A ray of sunlight passed through the lens, and a magnified image appeared on a rock by the pond. A blade of grass on the rock became the size of a finger. You could see the cell walls, the veins, droplets of moisture on the hairs. Soren watched. Her glasses had slipped down to the tip of her nose. She'd forgotten about them. Daniel said, "This is a microscope, a tool for seeing the tiny. Look what's in that drop of water. Write about it." "Your name will be first." Soren took off her glasses. Slowly, she put them in her pocket. She looked at the lens through the water, at a magnified blade of grass, at the cells on a leaf, at the world she'd wanted to see her whole life, but couldn't. Daniel saw her hands trembling. She hid them behind her back and said she'd stay if he'd let her. Daniel let her. The spring yielded 1,200 liters. 52 people depended on it. Soren changed everything. Not all at once, gradually. She was the first person in Daniel's circle who understood water not with her hands, but with her mind. Pak knew how to dig. T knew how to build. Mitso knew how to work with clay. Hana knew how to translate technical jargon into plain language. Yuna knew how to fight and keep quiet, but Soren knew how to think. She asked questions that Daniel would answer for hours on end. Why does water expand when it freezes? Why does steam rise? What is pressure? What is osmosis? What happens to water inside a living body? How do the kidneys filter blood? She wrote down every answer in a thick notebook made of goatskin leather that Miso had sewn. The notebook grew. By the 3rd month, it contained 80 pages of neat handwriting, along with drawings and diagrams. Soren called it a treatise on the nature of water. Daniel called it a textbook on hydraulics for the Middle Ages. But Soren gave him more than just an apprenticeship. She gave him an understanding of the magic of this world. Water mages did exist. There were fewer than 100 of them left on the entire continent. They could sense water from a distance, move small volumes with the power of their will, purify water of impurities. The temple of the first drop trained them from childhood. It took them from their families to settle debts or under contract. It taught them rituals and prayers, but it didn't teach them why water behaved the way it did. The temple's mages were like mechanics who knew how to press buttons but didn't know what was inside the machine. Soren was the exception. She wanted to know what was inside, and for that she had been considered strange for 10 years. No one at the temple wanted to read the treatise she had been writing before she met Daniel. Too many questions, too few prayers. On the 65th day, Soren told him about Telma. She didn't know that name, but she knew the legend, the ancient source, a being that had been sleeping beneath the continent since the beginning of time. The temple taught that the source had departed, left the world, left water to humanity as a gift and vanished. 7 years ago, the sky cracked. The rain stopped. The rivers began to dry up. The temple declared that this was punishment for sins. Daniel listened and thought. The source hadn't left. The source had been killed. The voice in his head, the very one that had been relaying the parameters to him, The source, the dependence, resonance. This isn't a system.
This is Telm, the remnants of an ancient being's consciousness.
The whisper of a dying being. Daniel tried to speak with it. He concentrated. He sank to the bottom of the pond. He shut out the outside world and called out quietly into himself. Telm, silence. Then not a voice. A sensation, like an echo, like a wave passing through stone, images, darkness, depth, a massive body of water the size of a lake. Thousands of years of sleep, then pain, poison, blood, screams. Many people, 1,000, drowning. They're being drowned on purpose. A ritual, an underground lake fills with the blood of 1,000 peasants, and the poison enters Telm's body through that blood. The pain is so intense that the rock above him cracks. The sky cracks. The year of the cracked sky. Daniel emerged from the vision. He was shaking. His whole body, 1,200 liters, trembled like jelly. The pond rippled. Hannah ran over. She asked what had happened. Daniel couldn't speak. A gurgling sound escaped his throat. After a minute, he pulled himself together. He said one thing. They killed him. The one who came before me. They killed him. Hannah didn't understand. Soren understood. She turned pale. She took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on. She asked who. Daniel answered. He didn't know who yet, but he knew how. A ritual, 1,000 people, an underground lake, blood and poison. Soren was silent for a long time. Then she said that 7 years ago, devouring had led a great water procession. He gathered peasants from the southern provinces, 1,000 people. He led them to the sacred lake in the west. They never returned. The temple announced that the pilgrims had decided to stay by the lake, to serve. No one checked. No one asked. 1,000 peasants. Who counts peasants? Daniel lay at the bottom of the pond and looked up at the sky through a meter of water. Lord Castor Varain, Una's father, head of House Varan. He killed Telma, killed 1,000 people, poisoned the aquifers throughout the eastern part of the continent, and all for a monopoly on water. Una stood by the canal. She heard it. She heard everything. The shovel slipped from her hands. She stood there, staring at the pond, at Daniel. He saw her face, pale, motionless. She knew her father was selling water at the price of blood. She didn't know that he had literally killed 1,000 people and an ancient creature older than all the houses combined for that water. Una turned and walked away, silently, not back to the house, out into the steppe. Daniel sent a drop after her, a small one, an inconspicuous one. He followed. She walked for 2 hours. Then she stopped in the middle of the dry plain. She sat down on the ground and screamed, not words, a scream, a long, ragged, animalistic scream, the scream of a person whose last foothold had been yanked out from under her feet. She screamed until her voice gave out. Then she sat there in silence. Daniel waited 10 steps away from her. By evening, she stood up. She returned to the village. She walked up to the pond. She looked at the water. She said hoarsely, "I'll help you stop him." Daniel replied with a murmur, "I know. The 4th month, the spring yields 3,000 liters. 112 people depend on it. The 5 villages of the valley are connected by canals. Little Selmer began to fill up. Not a river yet. A stream, thin, murky, slow, but flowing. The first flowing water in the valley in 7 years. Children from Koro and Malo came to look at the stream as if it were an attraction. They stood on the bank and watched the water move. Some of them had never seen flowing water in their entire lives. They were born during the drought and grew up in the dust. Daniel built a mill, not by himself, of course. He designed it. He sketched it on stones. Hannah translated the blueprints. T and 4 men from Koro spent 2 weeks building it. A very simple design. A water wheel. Vertical. The stream's current turns the wheel through a system of wooden gears. The wheel drives a piston pump. The pump draws water from the lower channel into the upper reservoir. The upper reservoir distributes the water in 3 directions. By gravity. No magic involved. When the wheel turned for the first time, and water began flowing up through the fired clay pipe. Ta dropped his hammer. He'd been building this contraption for 2 weeks and still didn't believe it would work. Water can't go up. Everyone knows water only goes down. Daniel explained the principle through Hana, communicating vessels, pressure, kinetic energy converted into lifting force, Hana translated. Uncle says the stream pushes the water upward through this contraption. It's like if you were carrying a bucket up a hill, but the stream is doing the carrying instead of you. Tay scratched the back of his head and said it was witchcraft. Hana replied that it wasn't. It's physics, she said the word physics with such a serious expression that Yuna laughed for the first time, loudly. On the 78th day, Erin arrived. She appeared quietly, like a shadow. She'd been following Soren all the way from the temple, a 2-week journey, alone. Without weapons, without food, with a prayer book and a flask of water. The flask ran out on the 3rd day. For the remaining 11 days, she walked on faith. Literally, she believed that the first drop would lead her to the living source. And it did. She reached the village at dawn, slender, pale, beautiful to the point of being uncomfortable. As any man in Takanka would say, if men in Takanka knew how to say such things. Her black hair, reaching down to her waist, was dirty and tangled. Her eyes were closed. She'd walked the last kilometer with her eyes closed. She could sense the water, like a mage. A weak mage, but a mage nonetheless. She reached the pond. She opened her eyes. She saw the water. She saw the canals. She saw the mill. She saw green sprouts in the vegetable gardens. She saw children playing by the stream. And she saw Daniel. He was standing above the pond in a watery form. He was training. He could already hold the form for 5 minutes. The silhouette of a man made of transparent water with a hint of a face and arms. Erin fell to her knees, and she cried. Not quietly, not gracefully, terribly, with sobs that tore at her body. She cried the way a person cries who has prayed for a miracle for 22 years and has finally seen it. Daniel was at a loss. He sank back into the pond. He cupped his hand, reached out to her. He didn't know what to do. He knew how to repair pumps and calculate the gradients of canals. He didn't know how to deal with people who fell to their knees before him. Hana approached. She lifted Erin by the hand. She led her to Miso's house. Miso gave her water, food, a blanket. Erin ate and cried at the same time. 2 hours later, she calmed down. She went outside. She walked over to the pond. She knelt down again. She began to pray. Daniel listened to her prayer, ancient words in a language he didn't know. The liturgy of the first drop. Beautiful, melodious. Erin's voice was such that the birds on the dead tree by the pond fell silent. Daniel let her finish. Then he raised his watery hand and said in a murmur, "Erin, get up." She looked at him. He said, "Don't pray to me. I'm not a god. I'm a mechanic. I'm the guy who fixed pipes and once drowned. Stand up, please." Erin didn't stand up. She didn't understand the word stand up, not in the linguistic sense, but in the sense of life. She had been taken to the temple at the age of 6 because of her family's debts. Since then, she had done nothing but serve, pray, kneel. 22 years on her knees, before the priests, before the senior mages, before the symbols and dogmas. No one had ever once told her to stand up. Daniel understood this, and he did what he knew how to do. He solved a technical problem. He asked T to dig a small pool next to the pond, 1 meter by 2, waist deep. He asked Miso to fire bake the bottom with clay so the water wouldn't leak out. He filled it with water, clean, warm water, heated through black ceramic pipes he'd devised a week earlier. The sun warmed the pipes. The pipes heated the water. A very simple solar collector. When the pool was ready, Daniel told Erin one thing through Hana. "You don't need to serve me. You need to wash your hair and eat something hot. Go." Erin stood by the pool of warm water. She watched the steam rise. She reached out her hand. She touched the water. Warm, truly warm. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bathed in warm water. At the temple, it was only cold, always cold. Cold purifies the spirit, the priests used to say. Erin stepped into the pool. Slowly, up to her waist, she closed her eyes and stood there like that for half an hour. She didn't pray. She just stood in the warm water and was silent. When she stepped out, her face was different. Not enlightened, not holy, just alive. She looked at Hannah, who was holding out a clean towel sewn by miso. She looked at Daniel in the pond, and she said quietly, "Thank you. Just thank you." No prayers. No kneeling, just one human word. The 5th month, the 6th, the valley was alive, not merely surviving, alive. The vegetable gardens were green in all 5 villages. Little Selmar had grown into a full-fledged stream 3 steps wide. Tadpoles had appeared in it. Daniel didn't know where they'd come from in a world without rain. Maybe the eggs had survived the drought in the dried-up silt. Maybe birds had carried them, but they were there, alive, swimming. The children caught them with their hands and squealed. Daniel watched this and thought that the tadpoles in the stream might be more important than anything he had built, because tadpoles are a promise that life is returning. On the 100th day, Lara Osmond arrived. She came in a wagon, a real wagon with a donkey and a load, 24 years old. The daughter of a major merchant and water trader from Melinar. She brought salt, 200 pounds, and a map of trade routes, and a proposal. Lyra had learned about the Tihanka Valley from her father. Her father had laughed over dinner as he told how some water spirit was dabbling in charity. Soon the House of Varen would crush him, and everything would return to normal. Lyra didn't laugh. A year ago, she had learned where her father's profits came from. He bought water from the House of Varen at wholesale prices and sold it to the peasants at a 400% markup. Children were dying of thirst a kilometer from his warehouses because their parents couldn't pay. Lyra renounced her father. She took her share of the salt, loaded it onto a donkey, and set off for Tianak. She entered the village and saw a mill. She saw canals. She saw greenery. She saw children with wet hair. She saw a woman rinsing laundry in the stream. Rinsing laundry in a world where water is more precious than silver. Lyra stopped the donkey. She looked for a long time. Then she walked over to the pond. She asked who was in charge here. Hannah said Uncle Dan was in charge, but he was currently underground, checking the pipes. Lyra asked when he would be back. Hannah shrugged and said when he was done fixing them. Lyra sat down by the pond and waited. Daniel returned an hour later. He emerged, his body glistening with water. He saw Lyra. He saw the cart loaded with salt. He saw the map Lyra had spread out on a rock by the water. Lyra spoke quickly, in a business-like manner, without emotion. The valley produces water. Neighboring regions need water. We need a trading system. Fair prices, routes, partners. She knows the trade routes. She knows who buys. She knows who sells. She knows how to calculate markups, logistics, and transportation losses. Daniel listened. For the first time, someone was speaking to him not as a spirit, not as a teacher, and not as a miracle, but as a partner. He said through the murmur, "Water is free." Lyra replied that free water is wonderful for the valley. But outside the valley, there are millions of people who also want to drink. You can't provide water to 1 million people for free. You can provide it at a fair price, a price that covers the cost of delivery and nothing more. Daniel was silent. She was right. He knew she was right. He's an engineer. He understood scaling. Free water in a single valley is a feat. Free water for an entire continent is a utopia. A system is needed. An economy is needed. A person is needed who knows how to calculate and isn't ashamed of it. He said, "Lyra, build me a pricing system. The first fair water pricing system in the history of Eridea." Lyra took out of her bag a piece of paper and a pen. She began to calculate. By evening, she had a table. The cost of water depending on distance, volume, season, and losses. Discounts for families with children. A free minimum allowance for every resident of the valley. Daniel read the table. He found one error in the logistics calculation. He pointed it out. Lyra looked at it. She recalculated. She corrected it. She looked at him. She said it was the first time anyone had found a mistake in her calculations. Daniel replied that she wasn't dirty. that she was the one who made his water affordable, that without her, he was just a wet spot with ambitions. Lyra froze. She looked at the water figure, at the transparent face without features, and she laughed. For the first time in her life, at the top of her lungs, loudly, openly, Una peeked out from behind the house. Soren looked up from her notebook. Aaron stopped singing. Miso stepped out onto the porch. Hannah jotted it down in her notebook. A new aunt, laughing loudly. By the end of the 6th month, the house of Varain had stopped laughing. Rumors of a share of Nantihanka spread throughout the entire eastern coast. Free water, the living spring, canals and mills, fair prices. Peasants from the surrounding provinces flocked to the valley in caravans. The population grew to 300. The spring's output exceeded 20,000 liters. Lord Castor Varain made a decision. He sent the army. The army arrived in the 8th month. 200 soldiers, cavalry, a supply train, an engineering corps with siege equipment, and Lord Castor Varain himself. He arrived in person, gray-haired, upright, in a white uniform with silver buttons.
A handsome old man with the face of someone who sleeps without nightmares, only with wine. Una saw him from the hill. She froze, turned pale, clenched her fists.
Daniel could sense her through the water she'd drunk that morning. Fear, hatred, and something else, longing, because he was her father. And despite everything, she remembered how he had taught her to shoot a bow when she was 5. The army stopped at the Melinar Dam. Daniel knew this dam, an ancient structure, a stone dam blocking the gorge north of the valley. Behind it lay a reservoir, small but sufficient. If the dam were destroyed, water would surge into the valley. It would flood the canals, destroy the mill, sweep away the villages, kill people. Lord Varain knew this. That was precisely why he had positioned himself at the dam. Not near the villages, but at the dam. He had no intention of storming 5 villages with 300 peasants. He intended to open the dam and drown them all, along with the source, because the source is water, and water, when swept along in a torrent of mud and rocks, ceases to be pure. Dirty water poisons Daniel. He knew this, and Varen somehow knew it too. Perhaps be from spies, maybe from the temple mage he'd bribed, maybe from the one who'd helped him kill Telma 7 years ago and knew the source's weaknesses. Daniel gathered everyone. Paka, Kanu, Miso, Una, Soren, Aaron, Lyra, Tay, the elders of the 5 villages. 300 people stood by the large pond, which was now the size of a small lake. Daniel stepped out to meet them in a human body, a complete one. For the first time, truly complete. A man 6 feet tall. His skin shimmered like water at sunset. His eyes were the color of the depths, dark blue with a hint of green. Miso had sewn his clothes for him, white linen, a simple shirt, and pants. He was barefoot because his feet were made of water and his shoes would have gotten wet. He stood before them and spoke with a voice, not a murmur. A real voice, low and calm, with a slight accent that no one else in this world had. He said that the army had arrived, that Lord Varain wanted to destroy the dam and flood the valley, that they had no army, no weapons, no chance in open battle. But they had him, and he was an engineer. Engineers don't fight. Engineers solve problems. The problem, the dam. The army wants to destroy it, so the water will flood the valley. So they had to make sure the water didn't flood the valley, even if the dam was destroyed. Daniel worked all night, alone, underground, in the aquifers, in the bed of the little Selmar, in every crack and every ravine of the valley. He wasn't building a wall against the water. He was building a path for the water. The old riverbed, forgotten, dried up 1,000 years ago. It ran from the gorge, eastward, past the valley, not through the valley, past it. If the flow were directed there, the water would bypass the villages and flow out into the steppe. But the old riverbed was clogged with rocks and earth, 1,000 years of sediment. It was impossible to clear it in a single night, for a human. But for 30,000 liters of intelligent water, water that senses every crack in the rock, it was possible. Daniel directed himself entirely, in its entirety. 30,000 liters surged into the old riverbed. It eroded the soil. It pushed aside the rocks. It washed away the debris. Meter by meter, 100 meters, 200, 500. A kilometer of the old riverbed was cleared by dawn. He lost 3,000 liters in the process. They seeped into the ground. But the riverbed was open. At dawn, Lord Varain gave the order. The engineering corps began demolishing the dam, stone by stone. Daniel stood on the hill overlooking the valley, in a human body. His men stood beside him, all 300 of them. Hannah held his left hand, wet and cold. Una stood to his right, Soren behind her. Aaron sang softly, not a liturgical hymn, but a lullaby. Miso held Lyra close, who was counting something on her fingers. A habit, a nervous habit of counting when she was scared. The dam collapsed. Water surged forth, thousands of metric tons. A roar. Dust. Lord Varain stood on a hill and watched as the wall of water rushed toward the valley, and he saw the wall of water turn. It didn't crash into the valley. It turned. It veered to the left, into the old riverbed, past the villages, past the canals, past the mill, past the people. The water roared through the ancient riverbed and flowed out into the steppe. The valley remained dry, intact, alive. Lord Varain watched this, and his expression did not change. Not a single muscle moved. He stood as still as a stone. Then he turned to his officers and gave the order to retreat. Quietly, without anger, without shouting, just to retreat. The army left. But Daniel knew this wasn't the end. Varain wasn't the kind of man who retreated forever. He was the kind of man who regrouped. 300 men stood on the hill next to Daniel and watched in silence as the army departed. Then Hannah tugged at his arm. She said he was wet and cold and that she needed a dry hand. Daniel looked at her serious face, at the birch bark notebook tucked into her belt, at the patched dress that had become too short for her because she'd grown over those months, and laughed, for real, out loud, for the first time since he'd nearly drowned. The evening after the battle for the dam. The sun was setting behind the western hills, bathing the valley in gold and copper. Little Selmar glistened in the last rays of sunlight. The water flowed smoothly and calmly. It didn't know that an hour ago it could have been a murder weapon. Water doesn't know such things. Daniel knew. He stood on the shore of the lake, his lake. In 8 months, a puddle-sized pond had turned into a lake. A small one, but a real one. With shores, with reeds that had sprouted 2 weeks ago, with tadpoles that had become frogs, with the reflection of 2 moons on the surface. His people stood nearby. Pack sat on a rock and wasn't coughing. For the first time that evening, he hadn't coughed even once. Henna stood next to Grandpa, holding a birch bark notebook. Everything was recorded in the notebook. Every leader, every channel, every decision Uncle Dan had made over the past 8 months. Miso brought rice, a large bowl of it, not for the water spirit, for everyone. She'd cooked for 300 people, and she had enough for everyone because Lyra had arranged for grain shipments from Melinar in exchange for water at a fair price. Una stood slightly to the side. She was looking west, toward where her father's army had gone. Her face was calm, not empty, serene. She had made her decision and no longer wavered. Soren sat by the water with a notebook on her lap. The notebook had grown to 120 pages. A treatise on the nature of water. The first scientific work in the history of Eridea, without prayers, without dogma, only facts and observations and equations that this world had not yet known. Erin stood ankle deep in the lake, barefoot, with her hair down, clean. She washed it every day in the warm bathhouse. She sang, quietly, not a liturgy, a song she remembered from her childhood, before the temple, before the debts, before the kneeling, just a song. Lyra was calculating. She stood with paper and pen, calculating the losses from the dam's destruction, the cost of restoration, compensation options, and new trade routes. She couldn't help but calculate. It was stronger than her. But now she wasn't calculating for profit, for the people. Daniel looked at all of them, at each one. He could feel each of them through the water they drank, which had become part of their bodies, through the sweat on Pak's palms, through the tears Miso no longer hid, through the blood in Yuna's veins. He was a part of them. They were a part of him. Not magic, not a system, not the resonance of dependence, just a connection, as simple as water. He turned toward them. All 300 people of the valley stood by the lake. Not all of them at the shore. Some were farther up on the hills. Some were by the canals. But all of them were looking at him, at the man who had emerged from the water, dressed in white linen, with wet feet and eyes the color of the depths. He spoke. "My name is Daniel Rowe. I was born in another world. I died saving a man I didn't know. I am not a god. I am a mechanic. I won't promise you rain tomorrow. I promise that I'll work, and that none of you will ever have to pay for a sip of water again." Silence. 300 people were silent. Then Hana stepped forward. She took his hand. Her palm was cold and wet, but alive. Hana lifted her head and looked him in the face. Then she turned to everyone, and she spoke loudly, very seriously as only children who've grown up too fast can. "This is my uncle. He lives in our well. If anyone touches him, I won't give them a drink." 300 people remained silent for another second. Then they laughed, all of them, together. Pak coughed hoarsely. Miso quietly covered her mouth. Yuna laughed briefly and sharply, as if the laughter had caught her off guard. Soren took off her glasses and wiped her eyes. Erin smiled, and her smile was such that Daniel forgot for a second that he had no heart. Lyra laughed loudly and openly, the way she had laughed only once in her life. Tay slapped his knees. Old woman Bo, toothless, giggled on a rock. The children squealed, not understanding what they were laughing at, but caught up in the general joy. 300 people were laughing on the shore of a lake that hadn't existed 8 months ago, in a valley that had been dying 8 months ago, in a world that had lost its rains 7 years ago. Then the first drop fell on Daniel's cheek. He froze. He looked up. A second drop. A third, not his. Not from the pond, not from the canal, from above, from the sky. Clouds. He hadn't noticed the clouds, thin, gray, low-hanging. They came from the west. They came on their own. He hadn't called them. He couldn't have called them. He didn't yet know how to control the clouds. They came on their own. Rain, light, warm, real. The first rain over the valley in 7 years. Not heavy, a drizzle. Barely noticeable, but real. The drops fell on the dry earth, and the earth darkened. Drops fell on the leaves of the seedlings in Miso's garden, and the leaves quivered. Drops fell on the reeds by the lake, and the reeds rustled. Drops fell on the faces of 300 people, and the people stood with their faces lifted, their eyes closed, and remained silent. They were silent because there are no words for rain after 7 years of drought. Hana stood next to Daniel and held his hand. The rain fell on her hair and ran down her face. She didn't wipe it away. She smiled. Daniel stood in the rain and felt every drop. They weren't him. They were the sky. The sky had answered, not because he asked, not because he deserved it, because the valley was alive again, because the earth was drinking again, because the trees were growing again, because 300 people were breathing and laughing and crying and working again. Microclimate. Daniel knew that word. The lake and the stream and the canals and the greenery had changed the valley's microclimate. Evaporation from the water's surface. Transpiration from the plants. Moisture rises, condenses. Clouds, rain. Physics, not a miracle. Physics? But standing in the first rain in 7 years, in a body made of water, with the hand of a 7-year-old girl in his palm, Daniel wasn't thinking about physics. He was thinking about the sailor. About the guy he'd shoved into the hatch a second before the bulkhead crushed his chest. He was wondering if that guy had made it to the surface. He probably did. He had to have made it. Telm didn't choose Daniel by chance. He chose a man who had died in the water saving another. He chose him because he understood what mattered most. You don't take water, you give water. Daniel lifted his face to the rain. The drops fell on his watery body and became part of it. Every raindrop flowed into him. He was growing, not through effort, not through accumulation. He was simply growing. The sky gave him water. Source, 41,000 liters. Dependence, 312. Full resonance. He closed his eyes. He didn't have real eyes. But he closed what was in their place, and he saw, far to the west, beyond the hills, beyond the steppe, beyond the mountains, an empty riverbed, vast, kilometers of parched earth where an ocean once was. Telm whispered to him, a final whisper, not words, an image, the ocean. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked at Hannah, at Pak, at Miso, and Una, and Soren, and Erin, and Lyra, at the 300 people standing in the rain, at the valley he had built from a single drop, at the stream and the lake and the canals and the mill and the vegetable gardens and the reeds and the frogs and the tadpoles and the children with wet hair. He thought that the valley was the beginning, not the end, the beginning. He needed to become a river, then a lake, then a sea, then an ocean. To bring the rains back to Aridia, find Telma's killer, stop Varain, build a world where water belongs to everyone because water is him and he belongs to everyone who calls him by name. Kana tugged at his arm. She said he was lost in thought again and that his face was running. Literally, the rain was washing away his watery features. Daniel looked at her serious, dark eyes, at the notebook she was clutching to her chest to shield it from the rain, at her slender fingers clasping his wet palm, and he laughed for the second time in this new life. The rain was falling. Light, warm, real, over the valley where 8 months ago there had been nothing but dust and 34 dying people. And now there was a lake and 312 living people and one mechanic from San Diego who had turned into water and didn't regret it for a single second. The army arrived in the 8th month. Daniel learned of it 2 days before their arrival. The daughter droplets stationed along the road to Melinar transmitted a vibration. Hundreds of feet. Hooves, wheels, the earth trembled. He sent a scout droplet down the road to the north. 6 hours later, the droplet returned with the data. 200 soldiers, armored infantry in leather armor with iron plates sewn onto it, 30 horsemen, a supply train of 12 wagons, an engineering corps with siege equipment, battering rams, levers, chains, and a separate wagon guarded by 8 horsemen. Lord Castor Varain was riding in it.
Daniel convened a council, not a military council. He had no generals. He had an old well digger and a 7-year-old girl with a notebook, a former aristocrat with a shovel, a scholar wearing rock crystal glasses, a priestess who had forgotten how to pray on her knees, and a merchant's daughter with a chart of fair prices, and 300 peasants who 8 months ago had been dying of thirst. Una spoke first. She knew her father's tactics. She knew how he thought. She knew he wouldn't launch a head-on attack on the villages. It's messy and expensive and creates bad stories. Varain didn't like bad stories. He liked clean solutions, elegant ones, the kind where your hands stay clean and someone else ends up taking the blame.
The Melinar Dam. Una pointed her finger at the map that Lyra had spread out on the rock. An ancient stone dam spanning the gorge 2 kilometers north of the valley. Behind it lay a reservoir, a small one. But after Daniel had uncovered an underground stream from the western part of the valley, the water level behind the dam had risen, several thousand metric tons. If the dam were destroyed, water would rush into the gorge and follow the old riverbed straight into the center of the valley. It would flood the canals, destroy the mill, wash away the houses, drown people, and the source, because the torrent would carry with it mud and rocks and silt and animal carcasses, dirty water. Daniel couldn't absorb the dirty water without consequences. Every liter of poisoned water cost him a loss of volume and days of recovery. Thousands of metric tons of the dirty torrent would kill him just as surely as the poison had killed Telma only faster. Soren confirmed it. The temple knew about the source's weaknesses. Ancient texts described it. Clean water gives strength. Dirty water takes it away. The torrent from the destroyed dam would be not water, but liquid mud, a mixture of silt, rocks, rotting vegetation, and everything that had accumulated behind the dam over the years. For Daniel, this meant death. Lyra added the figures. According to her calculations, the reservoir's volume was approximately 80,000 metric tons. The flow velocity upon the dam's collapse would be sufficient to sweep away stone walls. The time from the collapse to the impact on the valley would be 12 minutes, maybe 15 if the gorge narrowed the flow. 12 minutes. Daniel was silent. He was thinking. 300 people were looking at him and waiting. He closed his eyes. He dove beneath the surface with his senses. He headed north, toward the gorge, toward the dam. He scanned the rock, every layer, every crack, every change in elevation, and he found it. An old riverbed, ancient, dried up 1,000 years ago, maybe more. It began at the mouth of the gorge and ran eastward. Not through the valley, past it, along its eastern edge, between the rocky ridge and the steppe. If the stream followed this channel, it would bypass the valley and flow into the steppe, harmless. But the channel was clogged. 1,000 years of sediment, rocks, soil, the roots of dead trees. To clear it in 2 days. Impossible for humans, but for 30,000 liters of intelligent water, water that knows every crack in the rock and knows how to erode the soil. It's possible. On the edge, but possible. Daniel opened his eyes. He looked at his people. He said he had a plan, not a military plan, an engineering one, he explained, through Hannah, because speaking in a long, murmuring stream was difficult, and he was saving his human body for work. Hannah translated. Uncle Dan says he won't fight the soldiers. Uncle Dan says we need to dig out the old road for the water, so the water will flow past us. Uncle Dan says he'll do it himself. Underground, he'll need 2 nights. Una asked what to do if the army attacks sooner. Daniel looked at her. Through watery eyes, he said the army wouldn't attack the villages. The army had come to the dam. Destroying the dam was a job for the engineering corps. At least a day to prepare. A day to set up the levers and rams. Another day for the work itself. He has time. Una nodded. She knew her father. Vervain wasn't in a hurry. He liked to do things right, even killings. Daniel went underground that very night. All of him, completely. 30,000 liters drained from the lake, ponds, and canals. Only the water in the reservoirs and filters remained on the surface. Enough drinking water for 300 people for 2 days. Hannah rationed it out according to schedule. 1 liter per person in the morning, 1 liter in the evening. Children first. The elderly second, everyone else last. She stood by the well with a notebook and measured out the mugs. 8 years. She had grown up over those months, not just physically. Daniel was working, underground, in the dark, in cramped quarters. He directed all his force into the old riverbed and began to wash it away, meter by meter. 30,000 liters of water pounded against the walls of compacted earth and stone, not like a river, like a tool, precisely, into weak spots, into cracks, into pockets of soft soil between the rocks. He washed the earth away from under the boulders, and the boulders sank. He seeped through the roots of dead trees and tore them apart from the inside as he froze and expanded. He worked like a drilling rig and an excavator and a flushing pump all at the same time. Every hour, it advanced 50 meters. By dawn on the first day, it had cleared 400 meters of the riverbed. By sunset, 800. It was losing water. Every meter cost it liters that seeped into the ground and were never recovered. 3,000 liters lost by the end of the first day. 27,000 remained. Day 2. The army was setting up levers at the dam. Una watched from the hill through a homemade spyglass that Soren had made from Daniel's water lenses mounted in a wooden tube. She saw her father. Lord Vervain stood on a rise in a white uniform, looking at the dam. Next to him was a man in a dark cloak. Not a soldier, not an engineer, someone else. Una didn't recognize him, but something about his figure sent a chill down her spine. She told Soren, Soren looked through the tube. She turned pale. She said that standing next to Varain was the chief investigator of the Order of the Dry Word. The Order believed that living sources were a sin, that the drought was punishment for the existence of the sources, that the only way to bring rain was to destroy all the sources forever. They had helped kill Telma. They would help kill Daniel. Underground, Daniel didn't know any of this. He was working. 1,000 meters, 1,200, 1,500. The channel was widening, deepening. He was shaping the bottom and the walls, compacting the clay on the sides so the water wouldn't seep into the ground, calculating the slope. 2%, enough for a powerful current, not too steep, so the channel wouldn't erode. By evening on the second day, the channel was ready. 2 kilometers, from the mouth of the gorge to the steppe, past the valley. Daniel had lost another 2,000 liters. 25,000 remained. He rose to the surface, flowed into the lake, pulled himself together, exhausted. If water can be exhausted, murky, tired. Hannah was sitting by the lake, waiting. She saw the water in the lake churn and rise. She smiled. She said he was right on time, that the army had almost finished with the levers. At dawn on the third day, Lord Varain gave the order. Daniel stood on a hill overlooking the valley, in a human body, whole, truly whole, for the first time. A man 6 feet tall, skin shimmering like water at sunset, eyes the color of the depths, dark blue with a hint of green. Miso had sewn his clothes, white linen, a shirt and pants, barefoot. Watery feet and shoes are incompatible. His men stood nearby, all 300 of them. Hannah held his left hand, wet, cold, but alive. Una stood to the right, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw clenched. She was looking at the hill where her father stood, 2 kilometers between them, but she could see him, or so she thought. Soren stood behind Una, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose, a notebook pressed against her chest. Aaron stood slightly behind her and sang softly, not the liturgy, a lullaby, the one they used to sing to her on the way to the temple before she was given away to pay off debts. Miso held Lyra close. Lyra was counting on her fingers. A habit, a nervous habit of counting when she was scared. Pax sat on a rock. He wasn't coughing. He was looking west. Does stood with a hammer in his hand. Not for fighting. He'd just forgotten to put it away. The dam collapsed. A crack, the rumble of stone. Dust shot up dozens of meters. Water slammed into the gorge. Thousands of metric tons. A wall of muddy brown liquid surged through the stone corridor. Daniel watched. He counted the seconds. The torrent emerged from the gorge. It struck the fork. The old riverbed was on the left. The path to the valley lay straight ahead. Daniel wasn't breathing. He didn't have lungs, but even if he did, he wouldn't have been breathing. The torrent turned. Not all of it, not right away. The main mass slammed into the straight channel out of inertia, but the bottom of the straight channel was higher by half a meter. Daniel had deliberately left it higher when he cleared the alternative path. Water seeks a path downward, always downward. Gravity, simple physics. The main current slowed down on the elevated section and began to spill over to the left, into the old channel, into the cleared channel, meter by meter, ton by ton. The muddy brown water roared through the ancient channel past the valley, past the canals, past the mill, past the vegetable gardens, past the 300 people standing on the hill. Part of the flow did, however, go straight. Daniel had expected this, about 1/5 of the total volume. He directed himself there. 5,000 liters of his body formed a wall in the path of the muddy torrent. It didn't stop it. It slowed it down. It redirected it. It pushed it aside. He lost liters. The mud seeped into him and poisoned him. The murk rose, nausea and pain, but he held his ground. 1 minute, 2, 3, until the main flow had gone down the old channel and the pressure on the direct channel had dropped. 4 minutes. Then the pressure subsided. The flow weakened. It turned into a stream. The stream of muddy water flowed slowly along the edge of the valley and seeped into the ground before reaching the canals. Daniel let go. He collapsed back into the lake, murky, sick, having lost 3,000 liters to the mud, but alive. The valley stood, dry, intact, alive. On a rise near the ruined dam, Lord Castor Varain stood and watched. His face remained unchanged. Not a single muscle moved. The man in the dark cloak of the Order of the Dry Word, who was saying something to him. Varain wasn't listening. He was looking at the valley, at the hill where 300 men stood, at the watery figure that rose above the lake and waved to him. Varain turned around. He gave the order. Quietly, without anger, without shouting, retreat. The army gathered and left, slowly, in an orderly fashion, without panic. Professionals. The man in the dark cloak was the last to leave. He paused for a moment. He looked toward the valley. Even from a distance of 2 kilometers, Daniel felt his gaze. Cold, patient, assessing. This man wasn't retreating. He was memorizing. Una lowered her binoculars. She looked at Daniel. She said quietly that her father would return. Daniel nodded. He knew. Varain wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He was the kind of man who learned from his mistakes. Next time, he wouldn't come with an army. He'd come with something worse, but that would be later. Right now, the valley was at peace. 300 people were alive. The canals were flowing. The mill was turning. The sprouts were turning green. The frogs were croaking. And Hannah was tugging at his wet hand, saying he was cold and that she needed a dry hand. Daniel looked at her serious face, at the birch bark notebook tucked into her belt, at the patched dress that had become too short because she'd grown in 8 months. And he laughed, for real, out loud. For the first time since he'd nearly drowned in the icy waters of the Yellow Sea, saving a guy he'd known for 3 days. The evening after the battle for the dam. The sun was setting behind the western hills, and the valley was bathed in gold and copper. Little Selmar glistened. The water in it flowed smoothly and calmly, as if nothing had happened. As if 3 hours ago, thousands of metric tons of mud hadn't roared a kilometer from its shores. Water knows no fear. Water simply flows. Daniel stood on the shore of the lake. His lake, small, real, with shores overgrown with reeds, with frogs croaking in the twilight. With the reflection of 2 moons on the surface, a yellow moon and a blue one, alien moons of an alien world that in 8 months had become his world. He stood in a human body, skin shimmering the color of water at sunset, dark blue eyes with a green glint, a white linen shirt sewn by Miso's own hands, bare feet emerging from the water, leaving wet footprints on the stones. He stood and looked at his people. They were gathering by the lake. All 300 of them, not because he had called them of their own accord, like water flowing to a low place. Pak sat on a rock by the shore, old, thin, with hands that had dug the first well, with a cough that had finally subsided. He sat and looked out at the lake, a smile playing across his face, a quiet one, like that of a man who thought he would die in the dust, but instead finds himself sitting by the water, listening to the frogs. Next to Pak sat old Dan, the very same man who, in the early days, had sat motionless against the wall of the house, conserving his strength. Now he came to the lake every morning and fed the frogs breadcrumbs. No one knew why he fed the frogs, maybe just because he could. Because he had bread, and there were frogs, and there was water, and it was morning. Old Bo sat on her usual rock. She had been coming here every day ever since Hannah brought her the first jug. She just sat by the water. She was silent. Sometimes she dozed off. Daniel didn't disturb her. He knew that for Bo, having water nearby was peace itself. She had lived for 7 years in fear that every jug might be her last. Now she sat by the lake, knowing the water wasn't going anywhere. And that was enough. Miso stood by a large fire. She had built the fire and hung 3 cauldrons over it. She was cooking for 300 people, rice, herbs, and goat's milk. In 8 months, she had transformed from a quiet widow into the center of everything. Everyone ate from her hands. Everyone knew that Miso would feed them. Always. Everyone. Without exception. She no longer set out a bowl of water for the spirit by the pond.
Instead, every evening she brought Daniel a mug with his own concoction, the very same one. Salt, minerals, herbs. She set it on a rock by the lake and spoke softly. "This is for you, only for you." He couldn't drink from the mug. He was water.
But every evening she brought it, and every evening he absorbed the solution from the mug into himself, and he could taste her hands in it. Una stood slightly apart from the others, as always. She had never learned to be part of the crowd. The Lord's daughter, raised in marble halls, among servants and clans and intrigues. To her, the peasants were a different species. They were, 8 months ago. Now she stood with a shovel in her hands because she'd forgotten to put it away after her evening shift on the canal. Her palms were calloused, her nails were broken. Her hair was cut short so it wouldn't get in the way of her work. She was beautiful, sharp, stubborn, fierce, and beautiful, and she was looking west toward where her father had gone. Daniel knew what she was thinking, not because he could read her mind, but because he knew her. 8 months together. She was thinking that one day she'd have to stand between her father and these people, not metaphorically, literally. And she'd already decided whose side she'd be on. She'd decided on the day she learned about the 1,000 drowned peasants. She decided when she silently picked up a shovel and went to dig. Every day since then, she had driven the shovel into the ground, and with every blow, she buried the Una who believed that people were worth only as much as they could pay for a jug. Soren sat by the water with a notebook on her lap, 120 pages, a treatise on the nature of water. She was writing the final chapter about living springs, about how they are neither spirits nor gods, about how they are water that thinks, water that remembers, water that loves. She didn't use the word loves. She wrote a formula. Resonance of dependence is directly proportional to the volume of gratitude multiplied by the frequency of interaction. Daniel read the formula and said it was the most beautiful definition of love he'd ever encountered. Soren blushed. It turns out water mages blush to their ears. Erin stood ankle deep in the lake. Barefoot, with her clean hair loose, she washed it every day. Every day she would enter the warm bathing chamber and stand there with her eyes closed, smiling. 22 years of cold water in the temple. 22 years on her knees. Now she stood in the warm lake and sang. Not the liturgy, a song from her childhood. The one her mother used to sing before she gave her away to pay off debts. Erin's voice was such that the frogs fell silent when she began to sing, and so did the people. 300 people fell silent and listened, not because the song was beautiful, but because Erin's voice contained something this world lacked more than water. Hope that doesn't cut deep. Hope that sustains. Lyra stood next to Miso and helped portion out the rice into bowls. The merchant's daughter, the one who had arrived a month ago with a price list and a donkey loaded with salt. In a month, she had built a trading network. 3 villages outside the valley were buying water at a fixed price. The price covered the cost of delivery and 2% for infrastructure development. 2%, not 400, 2. Lyra was no longer ashamed of her talent with numbers. She calculated openly, quickly, with pleasure. And every time the total came out right, she smiled, a small, satisfied smile of someone who had found their place. T stood there with a hammer. He'd forgotten to put it down. He always forgot. A former shepherd, now the valley's chief builder, his hands had built a mill, 2 bridges, and 14 houses for the new residents. He didn't understand physics. He didn't understand gravity, pressure, or convection, but he understood wood, stone, and rope. And he trusted Daniel unreservedly. When Daniel sketched a diagram on a rock that looked like madness, T would take a hammer and build it. It worked every time. Every time T would shake his head and say it was witchcraft. And every time Hana would correct him. Not witchcraft, physics. Hana. She stood next to Daniel, holding his hand, a wet, cold, inhuman hand. And she held it tight. She was 8, almost 9. She'd grown over those months. She'd shot up. Her patched dress had become too short. Miso had sewn her a new one. Blue. The color of water. Hana said blue was right because she was officially the sister of her water uncle and had to wear his color. The birch bark notebook had long since run out. So had the goatskin notebook. Now she was writing in her third one, a leather one, a gift from Lyra. It contained all of Uncle Dan's decisions, all the calculations, all the blueprints, all the formulas. Everything Hannah could write down in the crooked handwriting of an 8-year-old. She was his memory, his voice, his chief engineer, his younger sister. Daniel looked at her and felt something that water wasn't supposed to feel, but it did. Everyone had gathered. 312 people. Daniel counted them through the water. 312. 8 months ago, there had been 34 of them. Half were dying. Now there were 312. All alive. All well-fed. All with water. With a roof over their heads. With vegetable gardens. With frogs and reeds. And children's shrieks by the stream. He turned toward them. They were looking at him, at the man from the water in white linen clothes. He spoke with a voice, not a murmur, a real voice, quiet and low, with an accent that no one else in this world had, because that accent was from San Diego, from a city on the Pacific coast of a planet where rain is an everyday occurrence, not a miracle. He said, "My name is Daniel Rowe. I was born in another world. I died saving a man I didn't know. I'm not a god. I'm a plumber. I'm a guy who spent his whole life fixing pipes and one day drowned. I can't promise you rain tomorrow. I promise I'll work and that none of you will ever have to pay for a sip of water again." Silence. Absolute silence. Even the frogs fell silent. 312 people stood by the lake and said nothing. Then Hana let go of his hand. She took a step forward. She turned to face everyone. She looked at the 300 faces, the old people, the children, the women and the men, at Pak and Miso, and Yuna, and Soren, and Aaron, and Lyra, and Tay, and old Bo, and old Dan. And she said loudly, very seriously, as seriously as only children can be, children who grew up too soon and yet remain children. "This is my uncle. He lives in our well. Whoever touches him, I won't pour them a drink." A moment of silence. Then Pak let out a raspy sound. It was laughter, a hoarse, elderly, gurgling laugh. Miso covered her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders were shaking. Tay slapped his knee and burst out laughing. Yuna snorted sharply and abruptly, as if the laughter had caught her off guard, and she hadn't had time to close the door. Soren took off her glasses and wiped them because they were fogged up, or maybe because of her eyes. Aaron smiled. She just smiled, without any pomp or bowing. The smile of a 22-year-old girl standing barefoot in warm water, feeling good. Lyra laughed out loud, loudly, openly, the way she'd laughed only once before, when Daniel called himself a wet spot with ambitions. Old Bo giggled toothlessly on her rock. Old Dan smiled for the first time in 8 months. The children squealed and cackled, not understanding the joke, but sensing that now was the time. That now was the moment. That laughter, too, is water. It, too, flows and quenches thirst. 312 people were laughing on the shore of a lake that hadn't existed 8 months ago, in a valley that had been dying 8 months ago, in a world that had lost its rain. And then a drop fell on Daniel's cheek. He froze. He raised his face to the sky. A second drop on his hand. A third on his shoulder. Not his drops. Not from the lake. Not from the canal. Not from the pond. From above. From the sky. He looked up. Clouds. Thin. Gray. Low. They had come from the west. Quietly. Unnoticed. While everyone was looking at him and laughing, the clouds crept up like cats and settled over the valley. Rain. The first drop fell on a leaf in Miso's vegetable garden, the second on the reeds by the lake, the third on Kana's hair, light, warm, barely perceptible, a drizzle, not a downpour, not a storm, a drizzle, the sky's whisper. The laughter died down. 312 people looked up. Drops fell on them, on their tanned, weather-beaten, exhausted faces, on their closed eyes, on their outstretched palms. Rain, real rain, not Daniel. He didn't know how to make rain, not yet anyway. The world had done it. The microclimate, the lake, the stream, the canals, and the greenery had changed the air above the valley. Vapor rose from the water's surface. It condensed. Clouds, dew point, precipitation. Physics. Simple, beautiful, inexorable physics. Daniel knew this. He understood every step of the process. He could explain it to anyone, draw a diagram, write down a formula. But now, standing in the first rain in 7 years, in a body made of water, holding the wet hand of an 8-year-old girl in his own, he wasn't thinking about physics. He was thinking about the sailor, about the young man with frightened eyes whom he'd shoved into the escape hatch a second before the collapsing bulkhead crushed his chest, about the jade pendant shaped like a drop that he'd felt against his cheek in the last moment of his life as he pressed the boy against him. The pendant was warm, warmer than the icy waters of the Yellow Sea. Telm felt him through that pendant. Through the anchor left 7 generations ago by a priest fleeing Aridea, Telm, dying, poisoned, betrayed, reached across the worlds and found a man who was dying in the water while saving another. And he took him, not because Daniel was strong or smart or special, because in the last moment of his life, Daniel wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of the sailor. If only the boy could make it to shore. You don't take water, you give water. Telm whispered to him quietly. From the depths, from the remnants of consciousness of an ancient being dissolved in the aquifers of the continent, not words, an image, far to the west, beyond the hills, beyond the steppe, beyond the mountains, a vast empty expanse, a dried-up riverbed, kilometers of cracked earth where an ocean once was. Daniel saw it. He felt the scale of it. He understood what lay ahead of him. A valley is the beginning. A stream is the beginning. A lake is the beginning. It must become a river, then a sea, then an ocean. Bring rain back to Aridea, not just the microclimate of a single valley. Real rain. Across the entire continent, to find Telma's killers, to stop Varain and the order of the dry word. To build a world where water belongs to no one, because water is him, and he belongs to everyone who calls him by name. Hannah tugged at his arm. He looked at her. Raindrops were streaming down her hair and face. She didn't wipe them away. She was smiling, broadly, like a child in the rain, like a child standing in the rain for the first time in her life, unafraid of the water. She was no longer afraid of water. For 2 years, she'd feared every sip because her mother had died from drinking water from a poisoned well. For 2 years, every pitcher had been a threat, every glass a trial. And now the rain was falling on her face, and she was smiling because she knew. This water was clean. Uncle Dan had checked it. She said his face was dripping, literally. The rain was washing away his watery features. His nose drifted to the left. An ear fell off and plopped into the lake. Hannah giggled. She said he needed to practice keeping his face steady in the rain, that she'd pour water on him from a mug, and he'd learn. Every evening. Definitely. She wrote it down in her notebook. Face training every day. She underlined it. Daniel laughed for the second time in this new life. His laughter sounded like water, like a stream rolling over rocks, like a lake whispering to the shore, like rain tapping on leaves. The rain was falling, light, warm, real rain over the valley, where 8 months ago, there had been 34 dying people and 1 dry well. And now there was a lake and a stream and canals and a mill and vegetable gardens and houses and reeds and frogs and 312 living people and 1 mechanic from San Diego. A drop that became a pond that became a lake that will become a sea, a spring yielding 22,000 liters, 312 people depending on it. Complete resonance. Daniel stood in the rain, holding the hand of the girl who had given him his name.